My son sent me a text message canceling our family Sunday dinner because his wife felt overwhelmed by my presence. He told me they needed space indefinitely and thought I would just sit back and accept being erased from his life. I replied with a single word. Then I walked into my office and initiated the sale of the $633,000 luxury condo he had been living in completely rent-free. He called me screaming a few days later, but by then the locks were already changing. My name is Malcolm Hughes. I am 70 years old, and before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my son's fake empire, let me know where you are watching this story from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned through hard work, not demanded through entitlement. The scent of smoked sausage and dark roux filled my kitchen. I stood over the cast iron pot stirring the gumbo with the slow, deliberate rhythm my late wife Elaine taught me decades ago. Every first Sunday, the family gathered at this table. Elaine established this routine to keep us grounded, to remind us that blood matters more than the chaotic noise of the city. I checked the wall clock. It was 2 in the afternoon. Sean and Victoria were supposed to arrive in an hour. I reached for the chopped celery. Then my phone vibrated on the marble counter. It was a text message from Sean. I wiped my hands and picked up the device. The message was brutally short. Dad, Victoria is feeling overwhelmed today. We are going to skip the dinner. Actually, Victoria thinks we need some space from you going forward indefinitely. We will reach out when we are ready to see you. I read the words 3 times. Overwhelmed by my presence. Space indefinitely. He was casually throwing away the father who gave him everything just to appease a wife who looked at me like dirt on her expensive shoes. I set the phone down next to the cutting board. I looked at my hands. They were heavily scarred, thick with calluses and permanently stained from 40 years of hard labor. I spent 4 decades working as a master electrician and commercial developer. I wired high-rise buildings in the dead of winter, working double shifts until my muscles screamed for mercy. I did all of that so Sean could walk onto the campus of a prestigious university without worrying about student loans. I paid for his entire education in cash. I wanted him to have a life where he wore a clean suit in a comfortable office. I succeeded. Sean became a corporate marketing director. But somewhere along the way, he learned to be deeply ashamed of the blue-collar roots that funded his success. Victoria accelerated that shame. She was 32 years old, entitled and obsessed with broadcasting a fabricated luxury lifestyle on social media. She viewed me as an uncultured burden. Whenever they visited, she would sit at my dining table, rolling her eyes at my stories, making passive-aggressive remarks about my neighborhood. Sean never defended me. He simply nodded along with her, prioritizing his wife's vanity over his father's dignity. This text message was the final nail in the coffin. He was choosing her aesthetic over my blood. A more emotional father might have demanded an explanation or reminded his son of every sacrifice made over the years. I felt no urge to beg. Disrespect is a clear language, and I understood it perfectly. You cannot force a man to value you if he has already decided you are worthless to his future. I picked up the phone. I did not type a paragraph. I typed a single word. Okay. I hit send. I turned around and walked back to the stove. I reached out and turned the burner off. The dark roux slowly stopped bubbling. The kitchen grew utterly silent. The family tradition was officially dead. I untied my apron, draped it over the chair, and walked out of the kitchen. I headed straight down the hallway toward my home office. My office was a shrine to practical work. Blueprints and electrical schematics lined the walls. In the corner sat a heavy fireproof steel safe. I spun the dial, feeling the familiar mechanical clicks under my fingertips. I grabbed the heavy handle and pulled the door open. Inside sat stacks of neatly organized documents, the silent accumulation of decades of smart commercial development and investments. I bypassed the personal files and reached for a thick black leather binder. The cover was stamped with bold silver letters. Apex Holdings, LLC. I carried the binder to my desk and opened it under the warm light of my desk lamp. Sean truly believed he had established absolute dominance by cutting me off. He thought he held all the power because he wore a designer suit and worked in a glass tower. He thought I was just an old retired electrician who would sit quietly in his house and wait for his son to throw him a bone. He was disastrously wrong. Sean completely forgot the reality of his own existence. He and Victoria lived in a stunning $633,000 luxury penthouse in the center of the downtown district. Victoria posted daily videos from that penthouse flaunting the floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic city views. She bragged to her followers about their success and wealth. But Sean and Victoria did not own a single brick of that property. They did not hold the deed. They were not on the mortgage. The property belonged entirely to Apex Holdings LLC, and I was the sole proprietor of that company. 5 years ago, Sean complained about the cost of living in the city. He claimed he could not save money for a down payment on a house because his rent was too high. Because I loved my son, I allowed him to move into the downtown luxury condo completely rent-free. The only condition I placed on the arrangement was that he pay the annual property taxes and cover basic maintenance. He was supposed to use that advantage to build his own wealth. Instead, he used it to build a fake life with a woman who despised me. He allowed Victoria to believe they owned the place. He allowed her to treat me like a peasant visiting their royal castle. He used my own property as the stage for his arrogance. And now he wanted to banish me from his life while continuing to sleep comfortably under my roof. I ran my hand over the official deed secured inside the leather binder. The silence in the room felt heavy, but it was not the weight of sorrow. It was the weight of absolute clarity. A man who demands space from his father should not be living in his father's house. I closed the binder with a sharp, definitive thud. The time for silent subsidies and endless patience was over. I picked up my phone again, scrolled through my contacts, and found the number for Robert Pierce. Robert was a ruthless, highly efficient corporate attorney who handled my real estate transactions. He did not care about family drama. He cared about executing contracts with lethal precision. I dialed the number, listening to it ring, fully prepared to tear down the fake empire my son had built. I dialed Robert Pierce before the engine of my truck even warmed up. Robert was not a man who engaged in small talk or offered unwanted emotional counseling. He billed by the minute and delivered brutal results by the second. When he answered, I gave him a single, unwavering directive. I told him to liquidate the downtown property immediately. Robert did not ask for family context. He simply pulled up the portfolio on his computer and informed me of the absolute legal realities. A commercial sale of a high-value residential asset required a certified interior appraisal. State law mandated it before any corporate deed transfer could clear escrow. I told him to book the best appraiser in the city for Tuesday afternoon. I knew Sean and Victoria would be locked inside their glass office buildings until sunset. I had retained the master key to the condo for emergency maintenance situations. This situation definitely qualified as an emergency. The appraiser met me in the polished marble lobby. His name was Arthur, a meticulous man armed with a laser measuring device and a digital tablet. We rode the private elevator up to the penthouse in total silence. I slid my heavy brass key into the deadbolt. The lock turned with a solid, satisfying click. I pushed the door open, expecting to see the sophisticated living space I had meticulously restored a decade prior. Instead, I stepped into sheer, undeniable devastation. I stopped in the entryway, my heavy work boots resting on something spongy and unnaturally cold. I looked down. The custom Brazilian hardwood floors were completely gone. I had spent 3 grueling weeks installing those floors on my hands and knees, perfectly leveling every single plank to ensure they would last a century. They had been entirely ripped out. In their place lay cheap, trendy gray vinyl flooring. The material was visibly buckling near the baseboards, poorly installed and entirely devoid of character. Victoria had traded permanent, expensive craftsmanship for a cheap, temporary aesthetic. She wanted the floor to look like a certain filter on her social media posts. The horror escalated rapidly when I looked past the ruined floor. A major structural wall that once separated the dining room from the secondary bedroom had been completely demolished. The ceiling sagged visibly where the load-bearing support had been recklessly removed. In the center of this newly manufactured void stood a cluster of bright ring lights, expensive camera tripods, and velvet staging chairs. Victoria had knocked down a structural wall without pulling a single city permit just to create an open-concept studio for her daily social media broadcasts. As a master electrician, I immediately noticed the exposed wires haphazardly capped and shoved into the drywall cavity. She had sacrificed the architectural integrity and safety of a $500,000 asset to get better lighting for her phone. Arthur stopped beside me, furiously tapping on his digital tablet. He pointed a steady finger toward the sagging ceiling joist. He informed me that the unpermitted demolition violated 3 different municipal building codes. The city would require a licensed structural engineer to brace the ceiling immediately or condemn the unit. He warned me that the fines alone would be astronomical. The value of the property was hemorrhaging right in front of my eyes. Sean had allowed his wife to gut a commercial asset because he lacked the spine to tell her no. He chose to destroy my investment rather than face his wife's entitled temper. I left Arthur to document the extensive structural damage and walked into the kitchen. The custom granite countertops were cluttered with empty artisan water bottles and discarded designer shopping bags. I walked over to the kitchen island and opened the top utility drawer. I was looking for the breaker box key to check the electrical panel. Instead, my fingers brushed against a thick stack of envelopes bound tightly by a rubber band. I pulled the stack out and flipped through the heavy paper. They were letters from the county tax assessor. The first few envelopes were marked as urgent. The envelopes near the bottom of the stack bore glaring red stamps indicating a final notice of default. I tore the most recent letter open. Sean had not paid the property taxes in 2 full years. He had blatantly ignored the singular condition of our agreement. While Victoria was buying designer handbags and hosting expensive brunches to maintain her digital illusion of extreme wealth, my son was quietly allowing a massive tax lien to build against my company's property. He was making a 6-figure corporate salary, yet he chose to fund his wife's fabricated lifestyle instead of honoring his word to his father. The level of financial negligence was absolutely staggering. I carried the tax notices back into the living room. Arthur finished his measurements and turned to face me. He delivered the final blow with professional detachment. The combination of the illegal, unpermitted structural demolition and the active municipal tax liens meant the property could not be sold through traditional retail channels. No standard mortgage lender would ever approve a loan for a residential buyer under these conditions. The condo had become a highly toxic asset. Arthur told me my only viable option was to offload the unit to a specialized corporate buyer who had the immense capital required to absorb the fines and repair the structural damage. The traditional housing market was effectively closed to me. I had to pivot my strategy immediately. I did not feel anger toward the appraiser. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Sean had destroyed the physical property just as thoroughly as he had destroyed our relationship. I thanked Arthur for his honest assessment and escorted him out of the building. I locked the cheap vinyl floor and the illegal social media studio behind me. I stood in the quiet hallway and dialed Robert Pierce for the second time that day. I instructed Robert to bypass the retail market entirely. I told him to seek out a cash-only corporate buyer. I specifically requested a conglomerate with a reputation for merciless property management. If Sean and Victoria wanted to play games with high-value real estate, they would now have to play against an opponent that possessed endless resources and zero empathy. I stood in the polished marble lobby alongside Arthur. The quiet hum of the high-rise HVAC system contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in my chest. Arthur handed me a printed summary of the code violations, his face completely devoid of optimism. He reiterated that the sheer magnitude of the unpermitted demolition restricted my buyer pool strictly to corporate liquidators. I shook his hand, thanking him for his thoroughness. As he walked out through the revolving glass doors, my cell phone vibrated in the chest pocket of my work jacket. I checked the screen. It was an out-of-state area code. Normally, I ignore unsolicited numbers, but decades in commercial real estate teach you to answer the unexpected. I pressed the phone to my ear. The voice on the other end was professional, crisp, and distinctly corporate. The caller introduced himself as an underwriter for a major national commercial bank. He stated he was calling to verbally verify the executive authorization on a pending commercial application. I kept my tone perfectly neutral, asking him to clarify the nature of the application. The underwriter explained he was processing a rapid approval home equity line of credit for $150,000. The applicant was Sean Hughes. The collateral listed was the exact downtown penthouse I had just walked out of. I did not gasp. I did not raise my voice. I leaned against the cold marble pillar in the lobby and asked the underwriter how my son could possibly leverage a property he did not legally own. The underwriter paused, the rapid typing on his end coming to an abrupt halt. He informed me that according to the paperwork submitted that very morning, Sean Hughes was listed as the primary managing director of Apex Holdings, LLC. Sean had provided a complete set of operating agreements, tax schedules, and articles of incorporation bearing his name as the sole authorized signatory. My son had forged federal corporate documents. He had completely fabricated an entire legal reality to drain the equity out of my company. I closed my eyes. The image of Sean sitting at my kitchen table years ago flashed in my mind. He was 22, dressed in a sharp graduation suit, rolling his eyes as I came home covered in grease and drywall dust. He told me that day that manual labor was a dead end. He claimed that true wealth was built in boardrooms through marketing strategy and corporate leverage. Yet a decade later, his prestigious marketing director salary clearly could not sustain Victoria's obsessive spending habits. He was drowning in the lifestyle he felt entitled to. Instead of adjusting his budget, he chose to steal from the man whose calloused hands had paid for his education. He had crossed the irreversible line from an ungrateful child to a federal financial criminal. I spoke clearly into the receiver. I informed the underwriter that I was the sole legal proprietor of Apex Holdings, LLC. I stated unequivocally that I had not authorized a home equity line of credit, nor had I ever transferred ownership managing rights or signatory privileges to Sean Hughes. I instructed the bank to freeze the application immediately. The underwriter's tone shifted from professional to highly alarmed. He offered to flag the file for the bank's internal fraud department right then and there. I told him to hold the formal fraud alert for exactly 48 hours. I needed the application frozen to protect my assets, but I did not want the bank tipping Sean off before I had my own legal measures fully locked into place. The underwriter agreed to lock the file in a pending status. I hung up the phone and walked out into the biting city wind. I sat behind the steering wheel of my truck, staring blankly at the brick facade of the parking garage across the street. Barely 30 minutes passed before my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed Sean's name. I let it ring 3 times. I steadied my breathing, burying the absolute disgust churning in my gut. I answered the call. Sean's voice came through the speaker, dripping with a falsely sweet, casual tone. It was the exact voice he used as a teenager right before asking for money to fix a mistake. He asked how my afternoon was going. He casually inquired about my health, pretending the brutal text message from Sunday had never happened. I gave him nothing but brief, agreeable answers. I let him steer the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. Eventually, he cleared his throat and shifted his tone to sound slightly inconvenienced. He claimed his corporate accounting department was running a routine compliance audit on his executive assets. He asked if I still had the original incorporation papers and tax identification numbers for Apex Holdings, LLC. He said he just needed a quick digital scan for his human resources file to clear up a minor tax code issue. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering. He was actively trying to secure the exact documents the bank underwriter had likely just requested to verify his fraudulent application. He thought I was just an aging, technologically illiterate man who would blindly forward sensitive corporate documents without asking a single critical question. He was banking on my parental trust to facilitate his felony. I played the role he assigned me perfectly. I let a slight hesitation enter my voice. I told him my filing cabinets were a mess and that my memory was not what it used to be. I promised to dig through my home office over the weekend and find the paperwork for him. I assured him he would have everything he needed by Monday. Sean let out a heavy sigh of relief. He thanked me profusely, his voice practically shaking with poorly concealed excitement. He told me he loved me and quickly ended the call. He believed he had successfully bypassed the bank's security check. He believed he was completely safe. I lowered the phone from my ear. The betrayal was absolute. The man I raised was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate parasite willing to financially ruin his own father to maintain his wife's digital illusions. I started the engine of my truck. The diesel motor roared to life, drowning out the street noise. I pulled out of the parking space and immediately dialed Robert Pierce. Robert answered on the first ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed the downtown condo liquidated immediately. I explained the unpermitted structural damage and the severe tax liabilities. I instructed him to completely bypass the traditional retail market. I wanted the property sold to Vanguard Properties. Vanguard was a massive real estate conglomerate known throughout the city for purchasing distressed assets for cash. More importantly, they were infamous for their ruthless legal department and their absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding squatters and delinquent tenants. They did not negotiate. They eradicated problems with extreme prejudice. Robert warned me that a corporate buyer like Vanguard would demand a steep discount on the purchase price due to the existing damage and the headache of evicting the current occupants. I told Robert I did not care about taking a hit on the sale price. I was not selling the property to turn a massive profit. I was selling the property to detonate the ground beneath my son's feet. I authorized Robert to accept Vanguard's first cash offer. I demanded the contract be drafted, signed, and legally recorded before the end of the week. Robert recognized the cold finality in my voice. He promised to have the preliminary paperwork on my desk by Friday morning. Thursday evening descended on the city with a biting, relentless chill that swept off the river and cut through the concrete canyons. I steered my heavily used Ford truck through the congested downtown streets, navigating the thick traffic with a mind entirely focused on execution. Vanguard Properties. The corporate conglomerate aggressively negotiating the purchase of the penthouse had demanded a final localized verification of the exterior property boundaries. They needed exact dimensions of the commercial loading dock and the private parking perimeter before their legal department would sign off on the closing documents. I did not send an assistant or an appraiser to handle this final step. I needed the cold air to keep my focus sharp. I pulled into the loading zone, a space strictly reserved for authorized commercial vehicles, and shifted the truck into park. As I stepped out into the freezing wind, my eyes scanned the lower levels of the luxury high-rise. That is when I saw the sheer magnitude of my son's financial delusion parked directly in front of the building. A fleet of 6 unmarked, pristine black vans lined the curb. Men and women wearing crisp white tailored shirts and black silk vests were aggressively offloading equipment. I watched them roll massive silver warming trays, heavy crates packed with crystal glassware, and towering boxes of top-shelf imported liquor onto the freight elevators. The discreet silver logo on the side of the vans belonged to the most exclusive, outrageously expensive catering company in the metropolitan area. I looked up toward the top of the building. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse blazed with golden light cutting through the dark city sky. The expansive rooftop terrace was alive with movement shadows dancing against the glass railings. The sheer hypocrisy of the scene struck me with the force of a physical blow. Just 4 days prior, Sean had sent me a callous text message canceling our sacred Sunday gumbo dinner. He had explicitly claimed that Victoria was entirely overwhelmed by my presence. He had firmly requested that I give them space indefinitely, treating a quiet traditional meal with his own father as an unbearable psychological burden. Yet here she was on a random Thursday evening, transforming my $500,000 asset into a chaotic, crowded nightclub. She was apparently not too overwhelmed to entertain dozens of strangers provided they validated her fabricated social status. I did not drive away. I did not call my son to demand an explanation. I pulled my heavy canvas work jacket tighter across my shoulders, walked straight through the service doors, and bypassed the front desk concierge who knew me by name. I stepped into the stainless steel service elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the car ascended, the heavy rhythmic bass of a live jazz quartet began to thrum through the elevator shaft. The doors slid open to the rear vestibule. I ignored the main entryway where a hired hostess was checking coats and instead used my master key on the secondary utility door. The heavy lock clicked silently. I stepped directly onto the sprawling outdoor terrace, remaining perfectly still within the deep, concealing shadows of a customized cedar pergola. I was completely invisible to the crowd, an undetected ghost standing on my own property. Over 50 strangers milled about the rooftop. They wore meticulously tailored suits, expensive silk evening gowns, and the distinct, arrogant aura of unearned wealth. Hired waiters circulated flawlessly through the crowd, balancing silver platters of caviar and pouring endless flowing flutes of vintage champagne. Sean stood near the roaring outdoor fire pit. He was laughing loudly, holding a thick imported cigar that he clearly did not know how to properly smoke. He wore a designer tuxedo that likely cost more than my first industrial work truck. Victoria was holding court near the edge of the reinforced glass balcony, posing for photographs, while a hired videographer recorded her every movement. I looked at this extravagant, sickening display of wealth and felt a profound, heavy disgust settle deep within my bones. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and remembered standing in the freezing, torrential rain 35 years ago. I was knee-deep in freezing mud, pouring the concrete foundation for the very first commercial warehouse I ever built. My fingers had been completely numb, my back aching with a relentless, blinding fire, but I refused to stop working. I built a legitimate empire on calloused hands, undeniable sweat, and absolute unwavering integrity. My late wife Elaine budgeted our groceries down to the penny so we could build a future of total financial security. I paid for every meal, every mortgage, and every massive tuition bill with honest, grueling labor. I opened my eyes and looked at my son. He was building a fragile, pathetic house of cards on a foundation of forged bank documents, staggering consumer debt, and stolen equity. He was playing the role of a brilliant corporate titan, using my money, my pristine credit score, and my property as his theatrical stage. I stepped slightly forward, keeping a massive potted evergreen directly between myself and the gathering. Victoria was speaking loudly, deliberately projecting her voice, so that everyone within a 20-foot radius could hear her. A group of older, wealthy investors leaned in, captivated by her fabricated charm and false confidence. One of the silver-haired men complimented the penthouse, marveling at the panoramic, unobstructed view of the glittering city skyline. He asked how such a young couple managed to secure such a highly coveted piece of prime real estate. Victoria let out a high-pitched theatrical laugh. She proudly announced to the entire group that she and Sean had purchased the unit outright entirely in cash. She spun a ridiculous, highly elaborate tale about their brilliant cryptocurrency investments and aggressive early market acquisitions. The investors nodded in deep admiration, thoroughly deceived by her performance. Then a wealthy woman in the group asked about Sean's family, innocently inquiring if his parents had helped them secure the purchase. Victoria's face immediately twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered condescension. She scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively in the cold air. She told the crowd that her father-in-law was just a pathetic, uneducated handyman who never amounted to anything. She explicitly claimed that I lived in a dangerous, rundown neighborhood and relied entirely on their monthly financial charity just to keep my electricity turned on. She loudly declared that allowing me to visit their penthouse occasionally was her personal way of doing charity work for the less fortunate. My jaw locked. The absolute disrespect was not merely spoken in private, it was proudly broadcasted to a crowd of corporate elites to elevate her own status. She was using my hard-earned assets to climb the social ladder while actively publicly degrading the man who provided the very roof over her entitled head. Sean stood merely 10 feet away from her. He heard every single word of her vicious lie. He did not correct her. He did not defend my honor, his mother's memory, or his own truth. He simply took a slow sip of his expensive whiskey, lowered his head, and smiled along with the cruel joke. The betrayal was absolute, irreversible, and final. I did not step out of the shadows. I did not storm the party, flip the trays of champagne, or demand an apology from my son. A public confrontation would only give them the dramatic spectacle they thrived on. It would allow Victoria to play the victim and paint me as the crazy, aggressive, uncultured old man she had just described to her guests. I operated on a much higher, far more destructive level. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out my cell phone. I ensured the flash was completely disabled and raised the camera lens. I snapped a single high-resolution photograph of the catered event. The image perfectly captured Victoria laughing maniacally, Sean holding his unlit cigar, and the massive crowd of trespassers consuming resources on my property. The photograph thoroughly documented their unauthorized use of the commercial space and the sheer undeniable scale of their financial delusion. I lowered the phone, turned my back on the lavish party, and walked quietly out the utility door. I rode the service elevator down to the ground floor in complete, satisfying silence. Once I was sitting safely in the cab of my truck, I opened my encrypted messaging app. I attached the photograph to a message addressed directly to Robert Pierce. I typed a brief, ruthless set of instructions. I told my lawyer to show this image immediately to the executive representatives at Vanguard Properties. I wanted the corporate liquidators to see exactly the kind of entitled, reckless, and destructive tenants they were inheriting with the purchase. I instructed Robert to accept any counteroffer Vanguard proposed, no matter how steep the financial discount. I did not care about the money anymore. I needed the final closing documents drafted, signed, and legally binding by the time the sun came up the next morning. The trap was fully loaded, the bait was taken, and I was stepping away to let the mechanism snap shut. Friday morning arrived with a bleak, overcast sky that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside Robert Pierce's downtown law firm. The boardroom was a masterpiece of sterile intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass panes offered a dizzying view of the financial district, while the temperature in the room was kept deliberately cold to discourage lingering or emotional negotiations. I sat at one end of a massive mahogany table. Robert sat to my right, his posture rigidly professional, his eyes scanning a thick stack of complex legal documents. Across the table sat the acquisition director for Vanguard Properties. His name was Sterling, and he looked exactly like the kind of man who evicted struggling families before breakfast. Sterling wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a month, and his demeanor was entirely devoid of human warmth. He was not here to negotiate a home, he was here to secure a distressed asset. Vanguard Properties was infamous throughout the metropolitan area for their predatory efficiency. They specialized in acquiring toxic real estate, leveraging their massive legal department to crush zoning fines and ruthlessly removing problematic occupants. They did not see tenants or families. They saw obstacles to profit. I watched Sterling carefully examine the printed photograph I had taken on the rooftop the night before. His eyes traced the catering staff, the illegal structural modifications visible through the glass doors, and the sheer volume of unauthorized guests consuming expensive champagne on my property. He did not look appalled by the chaos. He looked hungry. This was exactly the kind of legal liability Vanguard loved to absorb for a steep discount. While Sterling flipped through the appraisal report detailing the destroyed Brazilian hardwood floors and the unpermitted demolition, my mind drifted back exactly 5 years. I remembered the heavy, satisfying weight of the brass keys in my palm the day I handed them to Sean. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. We were standing in the very same living room that Victoria had now reduced to a cheap vinyl wasteland. Sean had just landed his first major corporate marketing role. I felt an overwhelming surge of parental pride. I truly believed I had successfully shielded him from the grueling, backbreaking labor that had defined my entire existence. I thought giving him a $633,000 penthouse free of rent was the ultimate head start. In my mind, I was providing a secure launch pad. I wanted him to take the money he would have spent on a mortgage and use it to build investments, secure his future, and establish a family legacy. Looking across the polished mahogany table now, the bitter truth settled heavily in my chest. I had not given my son a head start. I had unknowingly funded his total detachment from reality. My monumental sacrifice had not bred gratitude or financial discipline. It had bred a monstrous, unyielding entitlement. By shielding Sean from the crushing pressure of survival, I had allowed him to construct a fragile, delusional empire based entirely on vanity. I had paid for the stage where Victoria performed her daily acts of false superiority. The pride I felt 5 years ago was entirely dead, replaced by a cold, clinical necessity to correct my own monumental mistake. Sterling placed the photograph down and folded his manicured hands over the appraisal report. He spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding metal. He acknowledged the staggering municipal code violations, the active tax defaults Sean had recklessly accumulated, and the fact that the current occupants were entirely hostile. He made it explicitly clear that a traditional eviction process could drag on for months, costing thousands in legal fees and court appearances. Vanguard Properties, however, possessed a dedicated eviction task force that operated outside the bounds of traditional landlord patience. Sterling offered a cash buyout that was significantly below the market value of the penthouse. It was a predatory number designed to capitalize on my urgent need to liquidate the asset. Robert shifted in his leather chair, clearing his throat to launch a fierce counteroffer to protect my equity. I held up my calloused hand silently, instructing my lawyer to stand down. I looked directly into Sterling's unblinking eyes and told him I accepted the initial offer without a single modification. The money was completely irrelevant to me now. This transaction was about speed and absolute devastation. I demanded that Vanguard take the property strictly as is, absorbing every single fine, every structural liability, and the immediate forceful removal of the trespassers currently sleeping in the master bedroom. Sterling's thin lips curled into a faint predatory smile. He agreed to the terms instantly. Vanguard would assume total ownership by noon, and their private security contractors would take over the physical management of the unit immediately. Robert slid the final deed transfer documents across the smooth mahogany surface. He handed me a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of remorse, doubt, or parental guilt. I pressed the nib to the heavy paper and signed my name with sharp, definitive strokes. With that singular motion, the luxury downtown condo completely ceased to be a safe haven for my son. Apex Holdings, LLC, was entirely severed from the toxic asset. Robert immediately initiated the electronic wire transfer with Vanguard's corporate banking representatives. We sat in the sterile silence of the boardroom for exactly 14 minutes. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system. Then my cell phone chimed with a secure banking notification. The massive 7-figure cash settlement had officially cleared the Federal Reserve and landed directly in my corporate account. The transfer of power was absolute and irreversible. Sterling packed his leather briefcase, shook my hand with a firm, cold grip, and walked out of the boardroom to initiate his aggressive eviction protocols. Robert excused himself to file the recorded deed with the county clerk. I remained seated alone at the massive table. The heavy silence of the law firm wrapped around me. I unlocked my phone and opened my personal banking application. I navigated past the newly deposited Vanguard funds and accessed my automated payment dashboard. I scrolled down the long list of monthly obligations until I found the specific account linked to a high-end European automotive dealership. 3 years ago, Sean had convinced me that a luxury sport utility vehicle was absolutely essential for a corporate director to command respect in his industry. He claimed the monthly lease was just slightly outside his marketing budget. For 36 months, I had been quietly paying the $900 premium through an automated bank draft. It was a silent, invisible subsidy designed to protect his precious corporate image and keep him out of debt. I tapped the screen, selected the active auto-pay mandate, and hit cancel. A stark red warning prompt appeared on the screen advising that the cancellation would result in immediate financial default and swift vehicle repossession by the dealership. I stared at the warning for a fraction of a second. I confirmed the cancellation. The screen refreshed, wiping the scheduled payment out of existence. The financial safety net I had carefully woven for my son was completely obliterated. I slipped the phone back into my heavy canvas jacket, stood up from the mahogany table, and walked out of the boardroom. Sean had demanded space from me. He was about to get the entire unforgiving world. Monday morning broke over the city with a dull, unforgiving gray light. Inside the downtown penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with the stagnant aftermath of a lavish weekend. Stale champagne, discarded catering trays, and the lingering scent of expensive cigars cluttered the living space. Sean and Victoria were nursing the physical and financial hangovers of their extravagant networking party. Sean was standing in the kitchen brewing an espresso, desperately trying to reassemble his polished corporate composure for the upcoming work week. Victoria was still in her silk robe, sitting on the cheap vinyl flooring she had installed, frantically scrolling through her phone to check the engagement metrics on the photos she had posted the night before. Her entire public identity relied on those metrics. She had meticulously built a lucrative online brand around the aesthetics of this specific condo. Her followers believed she was a young, self-made real estate mogul. Every sponsorship deal she secured, every piece of designer clothing she flaunted, hinged on the fabricated reality that she owned a premium piece of the city skyline. Losing this location meant losing the very foundation of her digital empire. Her brand was an illusion, and the condo was the physical stage holding that entire illusion together. The heavy silence of the morning was shattered by 3 sharp, aggressive knocks at the front door. It was not the polite tap of the building concierge or a delivery driver. It was the rhythmic, authoritative pounding of someone who demanded immediate entry. Sean tightened his designer robe, clearly annoyed by the interruption, and walked through the debris of the party to unlock the deadbolt. He pulled the door open, ready to scold whoever had dared to disturb his morning recovery. A man in a nondescript windbreaker stood in the hallway holding a thick, legally binding manila envelope. The man did not smile. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply looked at a clipboard, verified Sean's identity, and shoved the heavy envelope directly into my son's chest. The man stated he was a court-appointed process server, confirmed the delivery was complete, and walked away down the carpeted hallway without another word. Sean stood in the doorway, staring at the thick envelope with mounting confusion. He closed the door slowly, his corporate arrogance temporarily suspended by a creeping sense of dread. He tore open the heavy paper seal and pulled out a stack of crisp official legal documents. The header at the top of the first page was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Sean blinked his eyes, scanning the dense legal jargon, desperately trying to make sense of the text. The document explicitly stated that Apex Holdings LLC had completely relinquished all rights, titles, and interests in the property. The deed had been legally transferred. The notice demanded that all current occupants surrender the keys and remove their personal belongings within exactly 30 days or face immediate forceful removal by armed private security contractors. The document did not list a forgiving private landlord. It explicitly named Vanguard Properties as the new absolute legal owner of the penthouse. Vanguard Properties was a name that commanded sheer terror in the urban real estate market. They were a massive corporate conglomerate famous for buying distressed assets and violently purging uncooperative tenants. They did not negotiate extensions. They did not care about personal hardships. They operated with a zero-tolerance policy, utilizing a massive legal department to crush any resistance. Sean felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His hands began to tremble violently, causing the thick legal pages to rustle in the quiet room. Victoria looked up from her phone, noticing the sudden, absolute terror radiating from her husband. She demanded to know what he was holding. When Sean read the eviction notice out loud, the fabricated reality of their life imploded instantly. Victoria dropped her expensive phone onto the floor. The color vanished from her cheeks. The panoramic windows, the open concept layout, and the prestigious zip code were suddenly gone. Her social media empire was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She collapsed onto the cheap vinyl floor, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized her lungs. Across the city, I was sitting in my quiet garage, systematically cleaning a set of heavy steel wrenches with a grease-stained rag. The physical rhythm of wiping down the tools kept my mind sharp and grounded. I knew exactly what time the process server had been scheduled to arrive at the penthouse. I was simply waiting for the inevitable detonation. My cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden workbench. The caller ID displayed Sean's name. I did not rush to answer it. I carefully placed the wrench back into the steel toolbox, wiped my calloused hands on a dry towel, and picked up the device. I accepted the call and placed the phone on the wooden bench, activating the speakerphone. The audio that flooded my quiet garage was a symphony of absolute chaos. Sean had completely abandoned his polished, articulate marketing vocabulary. He was screaming hysterically into the receiver, his voice cracking with an unhinged primal panic. He demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted joke I was playing. He yelled that a man from Vanguard Properties had just handed him an eviction notice. He threatened to sue me, claiming we had a verbal agreement, screaming that he had tenant rights and that I could not just throw him out into the street without warning. In the background, I could hear Victoria wailing uncontrollably. She was sobbing on the ruined vinyl floor, hyperventilating as the walls of her fake luxury life closed in around her. Sean shouted that his wife was having a medical emergency, blaming me entirely for destroying their peace and ruining their mourning. He demanded that I call Vanguard Properties, immediately reverse the sale, and fix the monumental mess I had just created. I stood over the workbench, looking down at my scarred hands. I felt absolutely no surge of parental guilt. I felt no urge to comfort the hysterical boy screaming on the other end of the line. Shielding a man from the consequences of his own deceit only breeds a monster. I let Sean scream until his lungs burned and his voice grew hoarse. I waited for the exact moment he paused to take a frantic breath. When the line fell briefly silent, save for Victoria's dramatic sobbing, I spoke. My voice was chillingly calm, entirely flat, and completely devoid of emotion. I did not yell. I did not engage in a passionate argument. I simply delivered the brutal, undeniable facts. I told him that I was fully aware of the 2 years of delinquent property taxes he had recklessly ignored. I detailed the massive, unpermitted structural demolition Victoria had executed just to create a vanity studio, a demolition that severely compromised the architectural integrity of my $500,000 asset. Sean's breathing hitched through the speaker. The realization that I had physically been inside the unit began to dawn on him. But I was not finished. I leaned closer to the phone and dropped the final crushing truth. I informed him about the call from the commercial bank underwriter. I told him I knew all about the forged incorporation documents and the fraudulent home equity line of credit he had desperately tried to secure using my company's name. I laid out his crimes with the clinical precision of a judge reading a final sentence. He had crossed the line from petty entitlement into federal financial fraud. I explained that Vanguard Properties owned the problem now, and Vanguard did not care about his corporate title or his wife's social media followers. Sean was completely paralyzed. His hysterical rage evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence. He realized the safety net was completely gone. I did not wait for his excuses. I did not want to hear his apologies. I delivered my final statement with lethal finality. You wanted space, Sean. I gave you the entire city to find it. You have 29 days. I reached down and pressed the red button, instantly terminating the call. I immediately opened his contact profile and blocked his number, ensuring the silence in my garage would remain absolute. The lesson had officially begun. The silence in my garage did not last long. By Wednesday afternoon, a private courier marched up my driveway and delivered a thick stack of expedited legal filings directly into my hands. Sean and Victoria had abandoned their hysterical panic and hired legal counsel. I stood over my workbench and read the name printed boldly across the heavy linen letterhead. Marcus Vance. He was a local attorney, infamous for his aggressive billboard advertisements, his loud television commercials, and his reliance on sheer intimidation to force rapid settlements. Sean and Victoria had filed an emergency injunction to halt the Vanguard Properties eviction process. The core legal claim embedded within the dense pages was absolutely absurd. Vance argued that Sean possessed a legally binding verbal contract with me asserting permanent ownership of the luxury condo through sweat equity. He claimed that Sean's payment of the annual property taxes combined with his quote-unquote structural renovations served as undeniable proof of an oral transfer of the deed. They were attempting to use the very damage they inflicted upon my property as evidence of their ownership. I placed the injunction documents on the cold concrete of my workbench and poured a cup of black coffee from my thermos. I had spent 40 years navigating the brutal, unforgiving world of commercial real estate development. I built my entire career fighting off corporate sharks, ruthless general contractors, and predatory vendors who actively tried to break multi-million-dollar deals over fabricated technicalities. I had faced down men who possessed the power and the capital to destroy a legitimate company with a single signature. I knew exactly how desperate men operated when their backs were pressed firmly against a wall. A petty theatrical billboard lawyer representing a lying son did not intimidate me in the slightest. I forwarded the digital copies of the documents directly to Robert Pierce. Robert did not sound angry, nor did he express any concern over the injunction. He simply logged into the judicial portal and scheduled the mandatory mediation session required by the presiding judge before the emergency injunction could even be officially reviewed. The mediation took place on Friday morning inside a highly sterile windowless conference room at the county courthouse. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless beige, offering absolutely no distractions from the severe reality of the legal situation. Robert and I arrived 20 minutes early. We sat on one side of a long, deeply scarred oak table. I wore a simple flannel shirt, durable denim work pants, and my heavy leather boots. I had absolutely no desire to dress up or participate in a theatrical performance for my son's benefit. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door swung open with aggressive force. Sean and Victoria marched into the room, flanked immediately by Marcus Vance. Victoria wore a sharp, meticulously tailored designer suit that clearly cost a fortune. She carried a pristine leather briefcase that likely held nothing but her bruised ego and her makeup. She took the seat directly across from me, glaring across the oak table with pure, unfiltered contempt. Her eyes were hard and venomous, completely blaming me for the imminent destruction of her digital aesthetic and her fabricated social standing. Sean sat heavily next to his wife, resolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. He stared fixedly at the center of the oak table, his posture rigid, defensive, and radiating silent panic. Vance remained standing at the head of the table wearing a flashy pinstripe suit and a deeply arrogant smile. He dropped his massive leather briefcase onto the wood with a loud theatrical thud, clearly intending to dominate the small room through sheer volume and physical aggression. The court-appointed mediator, a quiet woman wearing thick glasses, recited the basic rules of the session and invited the plaintiffs to present their opening statement. Vance immediately took the floor. He did not speak to the mediator. He directed his entire highly rehearsed performance directly at me. He paced heavily behind his client, speaking in loud practiced cadences designed to echo off the bare walls. Vance aggressively accused me of predatory financial behavior against my own blood. He claimed I had deliberately manipulated Sean into investing his own hard-earned money into the penthouse, only to maliciously steal the property out from under him the moment the value increased. Vance leaned across the wide oak table, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. He threatened to tie me up in endless, grueling litigation. He promised to file relentless discovery motions, subpoena my private bank records, depose my commercial associates, and drag this eviction case through the appellate courts for years. He looked me dead in the eye and stated he would not stop his legal assault until my entire retirement fund was completely drained by exorbitant attorney fees. He demanded I instantly reverse the corporate sale to Vanguard Properties, officially transfer the deed to Sean, and pay their legal expenses or face total financial ruin. Victoria smirked, crossing her arms confidently over her designer suit. She genuinely believed the threat was working. She believed I was just an uneducated aging handyman who would instantly fold under the pressure of a real lawsuit. I did not blink. I did not shift in my chair. I looked at Vance with the exact same expression I used when a junior foreman tried to lie to my face about a blown electrical circuit. I remained perfectly silent and let the heavy, tense air hang in the room. Beside me, Robert Pierce slowly and methodically unclasped the brass locks of his briefcase. He did not stand up. He did not pace around the room or raise his voice. Robert operated entirely on lethal documented facts. He reached into his bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic sleeve. He slid it smoothly across the oak table until it rested directly in front of Marcus Vance. It was the original residential lease agreement drafted and executed exactly 5 years ago. Robert pointed a steady, manicured finger at the bottom of the page. Sean's signature was clearly printed in blue ink, explicitly acknowledging his legal status as a standard month-to-month tenant. Robert spoke with a voice like cracked ice, devoid of any theatrical emotion. He read the specific clause out loud. The document contained a crystal-clear, legally binding stipulation stating that absolutely no equity ownership or permanent property rights were conferred by the tenant's payment of taxes, utilities, or basic maintenance. The entire sweat equity argument was instantly and entirely destroyed by Sean's own legally binding signature. Vance stopped smiling. He picked up the document, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text, searching for a loophole that did not exist. Sean swallowed hard, the remaining color turning an ashen, sickly gray. But Robert was not finished dismantling their illusion. He reached back into his briefcase and produced a second, much thicker document. He slid it across the table, placing it directly in front of Victoria. It was the itemized, certified invoice generated by the structural engineer and the commercial appraiser. The final total was printed in bold red ink at the bottom of the page. $50,000 for the illegal, unpermitted demolition of the load-bearing wall and the total destruction of the custom Brazilian hardwood floors. Robert informed Vance that while Vanguard Properties was officially the new owner of the unit, Apex Holdings LLC retained the absolute right to sue the former month-to-month tenant for the malicious destruction of corporate property. We were not sitting in that room to defend against a frivolous injunction. We were there to officially present the devastating countersuit. I watched Victoria closely as she looked down at the $50,000 invoice. She slowly moved her gaze from the red ink to the original lease agreement clutched tightly in her lawyer's shaking hand. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Her arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She turned her head slowly, mechanically, to look at Sean. Sean shrank back in his heavy wooden chair, desperately refusing to meet her eyes. The brutal reality of the situation crashed into her with undeniable force. Sean had lied to her for 5 years. He had firmly told her they owned the penthouse. He had allowed her to destroy structural walls and rip up expensive floors under the absolute fabricated delusion that they held the deed to the property. She suddenly realized that her husband was not a brilliant, wealthy real estate investor. He was just a month-to-month tenant who had been secretly living on his father's charity. The luxurious, enviable empire she had flaunted to millions of people online was nothing but a fragile lie built on a borrowed room. The legal ambush had not intimidated me at all. It had simply provided the perfect, inescapable lighting to expose Sean's massive cowardly fraud directly to his own wife. Victoria stared at the $50,000 invoice, her manicured nails digging into the heavy cardstock. The silence in the windowless conference room shattered the moment she turned her head toward Sean. Her voice started as a low, dangerous whisper before escalating into a piercing, unhinged shriek. She demanded to know why a month-to-month lease agreement had his signature on the bottom line. She asked him repeatedly where the deed to the property was. Sean physically recoiled, pressing his back against the heavy wooden chair. He stammered frantically, attempting to construct a fragile lie about corporate tax loopholes and temporary holding companies. Victoria did not let him finish his pathetic sentence. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping violently across the linoleum floor. She threw the heavy invoice directly at his chest. She screamed that he was a complete fraud and a pathetic liar. She had broadcasted their supposed real estate portfolio to millions of loyal followers, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was a glorified charity case living off his father. Marcus Vance tried to intervene, raising his hands in a desperate attempt to restore order and salvage the mediation. Victoria turned her venom directly on the lawyer. She told Vance he was a worthless ambulance chaser who failed to verify basic property records before taking their massive retainer. The court-appointed mediator quietly gathered her files, pushed her chair back, and declared the session officially terminated due to extreme hostility. Robert Pierce calmly closed his briefcase, the brass locks clicking with absolute finality. We had achieved total victory without arguing a single point or raising our voices. I stood up, buttoned my canvas jacket, and walked out the heavy wooden door. I left my son trapped in a nightmare of his own making, surrounded by the shattered pieces of his fabricated marriage. The crisp morning air hit my face as Robert and I exited the county courthouse. We walked together toward our vehicles in the sprawling concrete parking lot. Robert gave me a curt nod, confirming he would file the property damage suit against Sean by the end of the business day. He walked toward his polished sedan without another word. I reached into my pocket for my truck keys. Before I could unlock the heavy steel door, rapid footsteps echoed sharply against the asphalt behind me. I turned around. Sean was jogging across the parking lot, his designer suit jacket flapping wildly in the cold wind. The aggressive corporate titan persona he had worn inside the mediation room was entirely gone. His posture was hunched. His face was flushed red and streaked with sweat. He looked completely defeated. He closed the distance between us and immediately invaded my personal space, grabbing the thick canvas sleeve of my jacket. I did not pull away. I simply stared at his hand until he slowly, nervously released his grip. He started speaking rapidly, his voice cracking with desperate manufactured emotion. He entirely abandoned the legal threats and shifted his strategy instantly to severe emotional blackmail. He told me Victoria was pregnant. He claimed she had just taken the test 2 days ago and they were waiting for the right moment to announce it to the family. His eyes filled with highly engineered tears. He accused me of throwing my own flesh and blood out onto the unforgiving city streets. He demanded to know how I could sleep at night, knowing my unborn grandchild would be born into homelessness and financial ruin. He begged for a massive cash settlement to help them secure a new luxury place, insisting it was my absolute moral duty as a grandfather to protect his growing family. I looked deeply into Sean's watery eyes. I did not see an expectant father pleading for the safety and security of his pregnant wife. I saw a 16-year-old boy standing in our suburban driveway holding the shattered front bumper of his mother's car. Decades ago, Sean had taken Elaine's vehicle without permission and recklessly crashed it into a brick retaining wall. When I confronted him, he produced the exact same manufactured tears. He had begged and pleaded, expertly manipulating his mother's gentle nature until she completely forgave him. Elaine worked extra shifts to pay for the repairs out of her own pocket just to spare him the consequences. She always covered for him. I always paid the bills and looked the other way to keep the peace in our home. We foolishly believed we were protecting our son from the harsh realities of the world. Standing in the courthouse parking lot, the devastating truth washed over me with absolute clarity. My continued financial rescues had not protected him at all. They had systematically dismantled his moral compass and created this calculating monster. I refused to repeat the cycle. I squared my shoulders and looked down at him. My voice contained zero warmth. I coldly congratulated him on his impending fatherhood. I suggested he utilize his impressive marketing director salary to find a standard rental unit within his actual verified budget. I told him a newborn baby does not require a luxury penthouse with panoramic skyline views and imported marble countertops. I turned around, opened the door of my Ford, and climbed inside. Sean slammed his open palms against my window, shouting muffled curses through the thick safety glass. I started the heavy diesel engine, put the truck in gear, and drove away, leaving him standing completely alone in the exhaust fumes. I navigated through the heavy downtown traffic, gripping the steering wheel as the residual adrenaline slowly faded from my bloodstream. My mind replayed the parking lot ambush on a continuous loop. Something about Sean's desperate plea felt incredibly unnatural. The timing of the pregnancy announcement was entirely too convenient. A man facing imminent eviction and a $50,000 property damage lawsuit does not suddenly reveal a pregnancy unless he desperately needs immediate leverage. My intuition flared wildly, warning me that Sean was executing a secondary unseen maneuver while I was distracted by the primary conflict in the mediation room. I pulled my truck into an empty commercial loading zone and shifted into park. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and logged directly into my secure financial monitoring application. I bypassed the corporate accounts and pulled my comprehensive personal credit report. The screen loaded and the sheer audacity of my son's crimes stared back at me in bold red text. 3 brand new high-limit credit cards had been opened under my personal name within the last 48 hours. Every single account was already maxed out to the absolute limit. The combined stolen balance exceeded $40,000. I clicked on the detailed transaction history to verify the vendor codes. The charges were completely foreign to me. I saw massive electronic deposits transferred to luxury vacation rental agencies, high-end furniture showrooms, and exclusive private beach club memberships. I checked the mailing address associated with the fraudulent accounts. The billing details were securely routed straight to the downtown condo. Sean did not care about an unborn child. The pregnancy was a calculated, vicious lie designed to paralyze me with parental guilt. He fabricated the grandchild purely to buy enough time to drain my pristine personal credit score. He was aggressively securing a brand new luxury lifestyle before Vanguard Properties officially locked him out of the building. He had elevated his actions from basic entitlement to severe, undeniable financial felonies. My son had treated my lifelong financial reputation like a limitless piggy bank to fund his fraud. I locked my phone and stared out the windshield at the gray city sky. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire future. The glow of the laptop screen was entirely insufficient for the magnitude of the betrayal. I drove straight home from the commercial loading zone, walked directly into my quiet kitchen, and connected my encrypted laptop to the laser printer. The machine whirred and clicked in the silent house, spitting out page after page of fraudulent transaction histories. I spread the crisp white sheets across the worn oak of my kitchen table, the very same table where my late wife and I had spent countless nights balancing my contracting ledgers by hand. The total sum was printed in stark, undeniable black ink at the bottom of the final page. Over $40,000 had been systematically siphoned through 3 distinct newly activated credit lines. I ran my index finger down the itemized vendor codes, tracing the exact topography of Sean's delusion. He had not stolen this money to survive. He had not stolen it to secure a modest apartment or to cover essential medical bills for a fabricated pregnancy. He had stolen it to preserve an aesthetic. I read the charges out loud to the empty room, feeling the absolute absurdity of the items. There was an $8,000 transaction processed by a luxury European fashion house, explicitly noted as an expedited purchase for 2 designer leather handbags. There was a $12,000 swipe at an exclusive downtown horologist, securing a vintage imported watch. The most offensive charge was a massive $15,000 electronic transfer routed directly to a premier coastal beach club, paying for an elite membership tier that required a 5-year waiting list for the general public. I stared at these numbers and felt a profound, deeply rooted disgust. For my entire adult life, I had operated on a singular, unbreakable principle. In the working-class community where I built my contracting business, a man's financial word was his absolute bond. I had spent 40 grueling years meticulously maintaining a flawless credit score. Elaine and I had denied ourselves vacations, new clothes, and basic comforts to ensure we never missed a mortgage payment and never defaulted on a supplier invoice. I financed heavy industrial equipment and massive material orders on the pristine reputation of my signature alone. I built that financial armor with calloused hands, torn ligaments, and decades of relentless physical sacrifice. It was my legacy, my absolute proof of integrity. Sean had taken that sacred lifelong record and casually treated it like a limitless, disposable piggy bank. He must have memorized my social security number and the answers to my private security questions years ago, holding on to that data like a loaded weapon. He had weaponized my pristine reputation to fund a pathetic, shallow masquerade, effectively destroying my financial identity to buy himself a few more weeks of online validation. There was no fatherly instinct urging me to call him and demand an explanation. There was no temptation to cover the debt to save him from public embarrassment. The time for private warnings and leniency had officially expired in the courthouse parking lot when he used a fabricated grandchild as emotional leverage. I gathered the printed statements perfectly aligning the edges of the paper. I slid them into a heavy manila folder, grabbed my truck keys, and walked out the front door without a single backwards glance. The drive to the local police precinct took less than 20 minutes, but the transition felt monumental. I navigated my heavily used Ford truck through the working-class neighborhoods I had helped build, passing the brick warehouses and supply yards that defined my reality. I parked in the visitor lot of the municipal precinct, a brutalist concrete structure that offered no warmth and no leniency. I stepped out of the truck, clutching the manila folder tightly against my side, and walked directly through the heavy glass double doors. The interior of the precinct smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. I bypassed the main desk and requested to speak immediately with the Financial Crimes Division. Within 10 minutes, I was escorted down a narrow fluorescent-lit hallway and seated inside a small, windowless interrogation room. Across the scarred metal table sat Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator with sharp, tired eyes and a demeanor that indicated he had seen every variation of human betrayal. I did not waste his time with emotional preambles. I opened the manila folder and slid the comprehensive stack of fraudulent credit statements, the IP login timestamps I had pulled from my bank's security portal, and my official identity verification documents across the table. Detective Miller put on his reading glasses and methodically reviewed the paperwork. He examined the vendor codes, the delivery addresses, and the sheer velocity of the charges. He looked up at me, his expression entirely serious, and leaned back in his steel chair. He recognized exactly what this was. Family fraud cases were always the most complicated, often collapsing when the victimized parent suddenly developed cold feet at the prospect of sending their own flesh and blood to prison. Miller felt it was his professional duty to clearly outline the severity of the path I was about to walk down. He set the papers down and spoke with a low, authoritative tone. He explicitly warned me that this was not a civil dispute or a simple billing error that could be quietly reversed through my bank. Because the stolen amount drastically exceeded the state's felony threshold, filing this report would trigger an unstoppable chain of criminal events. He stated clearly that once I signed the sworn affidavit, the case belonged entirely to the district attorney. I could not retract it tomorrow. I could not negotiate a private financial settlement later to save Sean's corporate career. An automatic felony warrant would be issued for my son. Sean would be physically arrested, formally processed in handcuffs, and face mandatory state prison time for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Miller looked deeply into my eyes, searching for any hesitation, any lingering trace of a father willing to sacrifice himself to protect his child. I looked back at the detective with absolute, unwavering clarity. I reached across the table, picked up the steel pen resting near the file, and pulled the sworn affidavit directly in front of me. I did not pause. I did not let my hand tremble. I pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed my full legal name with aggressive, permanent strokes. I looked at Detective Miller and spoke with a voice devoid of any warmth. I told him I fully understood the consequences. I stated that a man who actively attempts to destroy his own father's lifelong reputation to fund a designer watch is no longer a son. He is a predator. I told the detective I was actively choosing my own survival over protecting a parasite. Miller nodded slowly, a profound respect settling over his tired features. He took the signed affidavit and immediately sprang into action. The bureaucratic machine engaged with ruthless efficiency. Miller booted up his terminal right there in the interrogation room and began drafting the emergency subpoenas. The trap was instantly closing around Sean's digital footprint. Miller explained his immediate tactical steps as he typed. He was actively subpoenaing the exact IP addresses used to submit the fraudulent credit applications, guaranteeing they would ping directly back to the secure router installed inside the downtown penthouse. He did not stop there. The detective aggressively targeted the luxury vendors. He submitted expedited warrants to secure the delivery logs and signature confirmations from the fashion house and the horologist. Miller noted that criminals of this specific arrogant breed always made the same fatal logistical error. They wanted immediate gratification and assumed they were untouchable. The delivery manifests would undoubtedly show the stolen luxury goods being shipped directly to the penthouse, effectively placing the stolen merchandise in Sean's physical possession. By setting the billing and shipping address to the condo, Sean had perfectly documented his own guilt. The evidence would be irrefutable, securely binding the physical theft to the digital fraud. I sat in the hard steel chair and watched the detective finalize the warrants. Sean had spent 3 years building an intricate, expensive lie. I had just handed the state everything they needed to completely dismantle his life. The Tuesday afternoon sky was a bruised, heavy slate matching the bitter chill that hung over my quiet suburban driveway. I was standing at the rear bumper of my heavily used Ford work truck, methodically organizing the heavy steel tools in the deep aluminum lockboxes. The rhythmic clanking of wrenches against metal was interrupted by the distinct low hum of a high-performance engine creeping down the street. I paused, resting my calloused hand on the tailgate, and watched a pristine silver Mercedes-Benz pull up to my curb. The luxury sedan looked entirely alien against the backdrop of modest 30-year-old ranch homes, cracked asphalt, and weathered chain-link fences. The engine cut off. The heavy reinforced doors opened with a solid, expensive thud. Victoria's parents stepped out onto the concrete. They moved toward me with the synchronized inherent entitlement of people who truly believed their bank accounts granted them absolute authority over any space they decided to occupy. Arthur wore a tailored cashmere overcoat, his silver hair impeccably styled against the wind. Beatrice clutched a designer leather handbag, her gaze immediately sweeping over the chipped paint of my front porch and my grease-stained work boots with thinly veiled absolute disgust. Watching them march aggressively up my driveway, a specific highly toxic memory surfaced with perfect, agonizing clarity. It was the evening of Sean and Victoria's lavish wedding reception. I had quietly paid for a massive portion of the elite catering service to ensure the event met Victoria's exact, demanding aesthetic standards. Yet Arthur and Beatrice had maintained total control over the guest list and the seating chart. They deliberately placed me at a dark, isolated corner table near the swinging kitchen doors, surrounded by Victoria's most distant elderly relatives. Later in the evening, Arthur had literally snapped his manicured fingers at me near the open bar, loudly mistaking me for a member of the hired waitstaff. When Sean hastily rushed over to correct him, Arthur did not apologize. He merely let out a condescending, booming laugh. He made a sharp, passive-aggressive remark to his affluent friends about my off-the-rack suit. He loudly marveled at how a man from such a gritty, uncultured, blue-collar background had managed to raise a son with such refined corporate tastes. I had locked my jaw that night and swallowed the bitter taste of public humiliation. I endured the blatant disrespect entirely for my son's sake, foolishly believing that taking the high road and absorbing their snobbery would preserve family harmony. That tolerance was now officially dead. Arthur did not wait for me to wipe the grease from my hands. He bypassed the customary polite greeting, entirely stopping 2 feet away from my truck and pointing a finger directly at my chest. He demanded to know what kind of sick psychological game I was playing with his daughter. He stated forcefully that Victoria had called them that morning in absolute hysterics, claiming I had hired corporate thugs to slide fake eviction notices under their door. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice shrill, sharp, and accusatory. She commanded me to stop harassing her child, immediately asserting that the penthouse belonged to Victoria just as much as it belonged to Sean. Arthur puffed out his chest in a pathetic, transparent attempt at physical intimidation. He sneered, declaring that he saw right through my agenda. He loudly accused me of being a bitter, vindictive old man who simply could not stand the fact that his son had vastly outgrown his pathetic roots. He claimed I was desperately trying to sabotage Sean's brilliant corporate trajectory out of pure malicious jealousy. He stated that an uneducated handyman was clearly threatened by Sean's massive professional success and Victoria's impeccable social standing. He raised his voice, threatening to unleash his own ruthless corporate legal team to hit me with a restraining order if I ever sent another piece of threatening mail to their luxury home. He promised to bury me in so much litigation that I would have to sell my truck just to afford a basic defense attorney. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back or cross my arms defensively. I looked Arthur directly in the eye, letting his hollow, arrogant threats dissolve completely into the cold afternoon air. I turned around, gestured steadily toward the front door of my house, and told them to follow me inside. I stated that if they wanted to discuss their son-in-law's brilliant corporate trajectory and massive financial success, we would do it over documented, undeniable facts. Arthur scoffed, casting a triumphant, smug look at his wife. He clearly believed I was retreating under his aggressive posturing. They followed me through the front door and stepped into the modest kitchen. I did not offer them a seat at the table. I did not offer them coffee or a glass of water. I walked directly to the heavy oak dining table where the massive black leather binder rested. It contained every single piece of official paper I had compiled over the last 72 hours. I flipped the heavy binder open. The sharp sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. I did not waste time with defensive explanations. I pulled out the first document and slid it across the polished wood. It was the certified county tax ledger. I instructed Arthur to read the bold red numbers detailing the 2 years of severely delinquent property taxes Sean had completely ignored while claiming to own the unit. I watched Arthur's arrogant sneer falter slightly as his eyes processed the massive unpaid municipal debt. Before he could formulate an excuse or question the document, I laid down the second piece of evidence. I spread out the high-resolution color photographs taken by the commercial appraiser. The images clearly displayed the absolute destruction of the custom Brazilian hardwood floors and the reckless, unpermitted demolition of the load-bearing structural walls. I informed them that their daughter's aesthetic renovations had caused exactly $50,000 in verified property damage. I told them a formal lawsuit had already been filed by my attorney against their son for malicious destruction of corporate assets. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her manicured hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the photographs of the ruined interior. Arthur tried to speak, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority, attempting to shift the blame back to my management of the property. I cut him off instantly. I reached into the back of the binder and pulled out the forged commercial bank application. I placed it directly on top of the photographs. I pointed to the signature line clearly showing Sean's attempt to illegally leverage my company's equity to secure a fraudulent line of credit. I explained the exact federal penalties for corporate financial fraud. Arthur's face turned the color of wet cement. He looked from the forged bank documents to my face, the reality of Sean's profound deception finally penetrating his thick skull. He realized he was not defending a successful marketing director. He was defending a desperate squatter who had been secretly living on his father's charity. But I was not finished. The final blow was the most destructive. I pulled the copy of the sworn police affidavit and the preliminary federal subpoenas out of the binder. I laid the stark official documents on the table. I informed Arthur and Beatrice that their son-in-law had stolen my identity. I detailed the 3 maxed-out luxury credit cards, explicitly pointing out the line items for the designer handbags and the private beach club deposits. I watched Beatrice's eyes widen in sheer horror as she recognized the exact description of the luxury handbags her daughter had proudly flaunted on social media just 2 days prior. I explained that the Financial Crimes Division was actively pulling the delivery logs proving the stolen merchandise was currently sitting inside the very condo they were defending. I stated with absolute chilling calm that an active felony warrant would be issued for Sean by the end of the week. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The arrogant, untouchable aura Victoria's parents had carried up my driveway was completely shattered. They stared at the mountain of undeniable legal evidence proving their daughter was married to a prolific lying felon. They had marched into my home to protect a wealthy real estate mogul. They found themselves staring at the charred remains of an intricate, pathetic illusion. Arthur slowly took a step back from the table, his hands trembling slightly as he reached blindly for his wife's arm. They had demanded the truth. I had given them the entire uncompromising reality. The oppressive silence in my kitchen stretched out thick and suffocating. Arthur and Beatrice stood perfectly still, their eyes locked on the undeniable evidence of their daughter's fabricated reality. The heavy stack of documents on my dining table represented the complete systematic destruction of the affluent lifestyle they had so proudly bragged about to their country club friends. Arthur stared at the $50,000 invoice for the ruined Brazilian hardwood floors. He looked at the stark red numbers detailing the delinquent property taxes. His gaze finally settled on the copy of the sworn police affidavit documenting the massive credit card fraud. The arrogant sneer that had defined his facial expression since he stepped out of his silver Mercedes was entirely gone. His face was pale, his jaw slack, and his breathing shallow. Beatrice gripped the edge of the oak table, her knuckles turning bone white as she stared at the itemized list of luxury purchases. She recognized the exact descriptions of the designer handbags her daughter had flaunted online. For years, Victoria had fed her parents a highly specific, meticulously constructed lie. She had proudly told them that Sean was a brilliant self-made tech genius who had aggressively navigated the corporate world to amass a small fortune. She had explicitly claimed that Sean purchased the downtown penthouse outright entirely in cash as a testament to his undeniable financial dominance. Arthur and Beatrice had absorbed this lie completely, wearing their son-in-law's fabricated success as a badge of honor in their affluent suburban circles. They had used Sean's imaginary wealth to elevate their own social standing, looking down on anyone who did not match their perceived level of luxury. The reality sitting on my table shattered that entire worldview in an instant. Sean had not bought the penthouse. He was a month-to-month tenant living on his father's charity. He was not a tech genius. He was an impending felon facing serious federal charges for identity theft and corporate fraud. The shame of this revelation hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. The socialite pride he had paraded around my property during the wedding reception evaporated into pure, unadulterated humiliation. Arthur slowly reached into his tailored cashmere overcoat and pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the kitchen floor. He did not ask for my permission to make the call. He simply tapped the screen, activated the external speakerphone, and set the device down directly next to the stack of forged bank documents. The digital ringing tone echoed sharply against the modest walls of my kitchen. Beatrice covered her mouth with her trembling hand, completely unable to tear her eyes away from the police report. The phone rang 3 times before Victoria answered. Her voice came through the speaker, crisp and overflowing with false confidence. She immediately asked her father if he had successfully dealt with the situation. She wanted to know if he had forced me to back down from the eviction and if he had properly threatened me with a massive lawsuit. She sounded entirely convinced that her wealthy parents could simply intimidate a blue-collar handyman into submission. Arthur did not offer a polite greeting. He leaned over the table, his face inches from the phone, and spoke with a voice that practically vibrated with rage. He demanded the truth. He did not ask a question. He issued a command. He told his daughter exactly what he was looking at. He listed the unpaid municipal tax ledgers, the catastrophic property damage invoice, and the undeniable proof of the month-to-month lease agreement. Victoria's confident tone vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, panicked intake of breath. She tried to stammer out a defense, desperately attempting to spin a story about a misunderstanding regarding a trust fund or a corporate holding company. Arthur cut her off with a brutal, roaring command to stop lying. He told her he was staring directly at a sworn police affidavit detailing 3 fraudulent luxury credit cards opened in my name. He explicitly mentioned the designer handbags and the private beach club deposits. The sound of Victoria's fabricated world collapsing came through the speaker as a high-pitched, hysterical sob. She broke down completely. The pristine, untouchable influencer persona dissolved into the terrified cries of a woman caught in a massive criminal conspiracy. When confronted with the undeniable documented truth, Victoria instantly turned on her husband. She screamed through her tears that Sean had lied to her. She loudly claimed she had absolutely no idea the penthouse belonged to me. She swore she believed Sean had bought the property with his own money and that he had managed all the finances entirely on his own. She aggressively threw the man she had married directly under the bus, portraying herself as a naive, innocent victim of Sean's elaborate financial manipulation. She begged her father to send his corporate lawyers to rescue her from the impending felony charges, screaming that Sean had ruined her life and destroyed her perfect brand. Arthur and Beatrice listened to their daughter's hysterical meltdown in absolute chilling silence. Wealthy people do not accumulate and protect their assets by allowing emotion to override financial logic. They operate on self-preservation. Arthur looked at the police report, understanding clearly that any attempt to legally defend Sean and Victoria would require him to fight a losing battle against federal fraud investigators. He recognized that Vanguard Properties would relentlessly pursue the $50,000 in property damages. Defending this catastrophic mess would require hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal retainers with absolutely zero guarantee of a positive outcome. Arthur was a man who protected his own interests above all else. He was not about to sink his meticulously guarded retirement funds into a bottomless pit of criminal debt and public humiliation. He leaned closer to the phone and delivered his final, devastating verdict. He spoke with a cold, surgical precision that mirrored my own approach to the situation. He told Victoria that she had made her bed with a liar and a thief. He explicitly stated that neither he nor her mother would spend a single dime of their own money to bail her out of a federal fraud investigation. He told her she was an adult who needed to face the severe legal consequences of her own arrogance and her own destructive vanity. Victoria shrieked through the speaker, begging her parents not to abandon her, pleading for a loan for a lawyer for any kind of financial lifeline. Arthur simply reached forward and terminated the call, cutting off her desperate cries mid-sentence. The kitchen descended back into heavy, absolute silence. Arthur picked up his phone and slid it back into his cashmere coat. He did not look at me. He did not offer an apology for his earlier threats, nor did he acknowledge the profound disrespect he had shown me at the wedding. He simply turned around and walked stiffly toward the front door. Beatrice followed immediately behind him, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. They walked out of my house without uttering another word, their arrogant posture completely broken. I stood in my kitchen and watched through the window as they climbed back into their pristine silver Mercedes and drove away down the quiet suburban street. They were leaving their daughter to face the full, unforgiving wrath of the legal system alone. The final pillar of Sean and Victoria's support system had just completely collapsed. I slowly closed the heavy black binder, aligning the edges of the police reports and the eviction notices. The trap was now fully closed, and the isolation of my son was absolute. The absolute silence of my kitchen was a stark contrast to the explosive confrontation that had just concluded. I stood at the oak dining table, running my hands over the smooth leather cover of the heavy binder. Arthur and Beatrice were gone, taking their suffocating arrogance and their checkbooks with them. They had driven away, choosing to protect their own comfortable retirement over rescuing a daughter who had knowingly married into a massive financial fraud. I walked over to the coffee maker, poured the remaining dark liquid down the stainless steel sink, and began to wash the carafe. My mind was entirely focused on the next logistical step of the eviction timeline. I did not expect an apology from Sean, nor did I anticipate a sudden moment of clarity from his wife. Cornered animals do not reflect on their mistakes. They lash out. Exactly 30 minutes after the silver Mercedes pulled out of my driveway, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop, the screen illuminated with Victoria's contact name. I dried my hands methodically on a cotton towel, picked up the device, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I did not offer a greeting. I simply held the receiver to my ear and waited for the inevitable explosion. Victoria did not speak. She shrieked. The sound that tore through the phone speaker was an unhinged feral noise, completely stripped of the carefully curated, soft-spoken influencer persona she utilized for her online videos. She was operating in a state of pure, unfiltered hysteria. She screamed that I had maliciously destroyed her life. She blamed me entirely for the catastrophic collapse of her relationship with her parents. Arthur and Beatrice had apparently just called her from their car, officially informing her that she was completely cut off from the family trust. They had explicitly refused to wire her a single dollar for legal retainers, moving expenses, or a new security deposit. Victoria raged that her sponsors were already beginning to drop her contracts because the aesthetic foundation of her brand was imploding. She accused me of being a bitter, jealous monster who could not handle seeing young people succeed. She utterly refused to acknowledge the forged bank documents, the stolen credit cards, or the fact that she had been living rent-free on my dime. In her fractured reality, I was the sole villain who had orchestrated her downfall out of pure spite. I stood motionless in the center of the kitchen, listening to her venomous rant. I did not interrupt her. I did not attempt to defend my actions or point out the severe legal jeopardy Sean had placed them both in. I simply reached up and tapped the screen of my phone, silently activating the digital call recording application. A small red timer appeared, documenting every single frantic threat pouring out of her mouth. When Victoria realized that her emotional manipulation and aggressive blame were bouncing off an absolute wall of silence, her tactic violently shifted. The desperate victim routine vanished instantly, replaced by a scorched earth threat of total destruction. She declared that if she and Sean were being forced out of the prestigious zip code, they would leave nothing but a completely gutted wasteland behind. She wanted to hurt me financially, assuming that I still held the deed to the property and would be physically responsible for repairing whatever damage she inflicted. Her voice dropped an octave, turning cold and deeply vindictive. She explicitly detailed her violent intentions. She threatened to take a heavy steel hammer to the massive custom-imported marble kitchen island she had forced Sean to install. She promised to shatter every single floor-to-ceiling window pane that overlooked the glittering city skyline, exposing the interior of the penthouse to the freezing rain and wind. She swore she would completely strip the copper wiring from the walls and flood the remaining hardwood floors until the entire unit was categorized as a total irrecoverable loss. Listening to her meticulously outline her plans for property destruction, a deep, familiar grimness settled in my chest. Over my 4 decades in the gritty commercial contracting industry, I had witnessed firsthand the staggering, catastrophic damage that bitter, desperate occupants could inflict upon a building. I had walked into foreclosed industrial spaces and evicted residential units that looked like active war zones. I knew perfectly well that angry people would pour industrial, fast-setting quick-rate cement directly down the main plumbing lines, completely destroying the building's infrastructure from the inside out. I had seen bankrupt business owners take heavy sledgehammers to load-bearing concrete pillars just to exact a final measure of petty destructive revenge against the banks that repossessed their spaces. When a person realizes their fabricated empire is completely collapsing, their primary instinct is to ensure nobody else can profit from the ruins. I knew Victoria was not making an idle, dramatic threat. An entitled, cornered woman facing the immediate loss of her entire public identity was highly capable of executing every single act of vandalism she had just described. She paused her tirade, breathing heavily into the receiver, waiting for my reaction. She desperately wanted to hear me panic. She needed me to beg her to stop, to offer a financial compromise to save the expensive real estate. I did not give her the satisfaction of a prolonged argument. I spoke with a voice as hard and unyielding as concrete. I informed her that she was severely misdirecting her anger. I calmly reminded her that Apex Holdings LLC no longer possessed the deed to the penthouse. I stated that the imported marble island, the panoramic windows, and the plumbing she planned to destroy were the exclusive legal property of Vanguard Properties. I told her she was free to take a hammer to the walls, provided she was prepared to face a massive corporate conglomerate in federal court for the intentional destruction of their asset. I pressed the red button, instantly terminating the call, and saved the audio file to my secure drive. I immediately opened my encrypted email client and drafted a new message. I addressed it directly to Sterling, the ruthless acquisition director I had met in the boardroom. I attached the audio recording of Victoria's unhinged vandalism threat. I typed a brief clinical message outlining the active, explicitly stated danger to his newly acquired investment. I hit send and closed the laptop. The problem no longer belonged to me. It belonged to an entity with infinite legal resources and zero emotional attachment. Vanguard Properties did not operate like a sluggish, bureaucratic municipal landlord. They viewed real estate strictly as capital, and they protected their investments with the swift, uncompromising precision of a military operation. They did not wait for the vandalism to occur. They did not file a preemptive warning with the local precinct. They responded to the audio file with overwhelming immediate force. Within 3 hours of receiving my email, Sterling dispatched a specialized team of private armed security contractors directly to the downtown high-rise. These were not polite building concierges or passive night watchmen. They were highly trained corporate enforcers wearing tactical gear tasked exclusively with asset protection. The team immediately established a hard physical perimeter in the building's main marble lobby, intercepting every single person attempting to access the top floor. A secondary unit bypassed the elevators and stationed themselves directly in the carpeted hallway outside the penthouse doors. The security contractors did not knock or engage with Sean and Victoria. They simply stood guard in the corridor with their arms crossed, creating a permanent, highly visible barrier. They were legally authorized to monitor the unit around the clock to ensure absolutely no construction equipment, heavy tools, or large uninspected items were brought into the space during the final week of the eviction period. The message from the corporate giant was deafeningly clear. Any attempt to damage the property would be met with immediate physical detention and severe criminal prosecution. Sean and Victoria were no longer living in a luxury home. They were effectively prisoners inside an active corporate surveillance zone, completely trapped by their own impulsive threats. The walls of their fabricated empire were rapidly closing in, and they had absolutely nowhere left to run. The presence of the Vanguard security contractors transformed the 34th floor of the luxury high-rise into a hostile, tightly monitored quarantine zone. It was day 28 of the official eviction notice. The legal clock was mercilessly ticking down to zero, leaving a suffocating heavy tension suspended in the air. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with the visceral reality of imminent total ruin. The sweeping panoramic views of the city skyline, which had once served as the ultimate flawless backdrop for Victoria's curated social media empire, now felt like the transparent bars of a gilded cage. The pristine imported marble countertops and the custom Brazilian hardwood floors were completely covered in a chaotic, sprawling mess of cheap brown cardboard moving boxes. The contrast between the elite architectural surroundings and the desperate packing process was physically jarring. Sean stood in the center of the devastated living room, his chest heaving as he aggressively shoved tailored $1,000 Italian suits into a flimsy cardboard container. The plastic tape gun made a harsh, grating screech as he violently sealed another box. He was sweating heavily through his designer dress shirt, his hands shaking with a toxic, paralyzing cocktail of adrenaline and profound panic. He was not just packing his belongings. He was packing away the charred remains of a fraudulent corporate identity that had completely collapsed around him. Across the spacious room, Victoria was violently sweeping her extensive, highly expensive collection of designer cosmetics and skincare products directly into a heavy plastic bin. They had not spoken a civil, productive word to each other in over 48 hours. The heavy silence in the penthouse was constantly shattered by explosive, vicious arguments that echoed harshly off the vaulted ceilings. Victoria slammed a heavy, imported glass perfume bottle into the edge of the bin, shattering it completely. The sharp, overwhelming scent of pure alcohol and rich floral notes instantly flooded the room, but neither of them stopped to clean the dangerous shards of glass scattered across the floor. She whirled around, pointing a perfectly manicured, shaking finger directly at Sean. Her face was twisted into a harsh mask of absolute, unfiltered contempt. She shrieked that she had utterly wasted the absolute best years of her life on a pathetic, glorified con artist. She viciously demanded to know how he expected her to survive in a standard working-class apartment completely cut off from her parents' wealthy trust fund and entirely stripped of her luxury aesthetic. Sean stopped taping the cardboard box and looked at his wife. The heavy, volatile silence hung between them like a physical weight. The manic, frantic panic in his chest slowly solidified into a cold, hard knot of absolute clarity. He stared at the woman he had aggressively pursued and meticulously lied to, finally understanding the brutal, foundational truth of their entire marriage. Victoria had never respected his intellect, his professional drive, or his personality. Her affection and her loyalty were entirely exclusively tied to the square footage of the downtown penthouse and the limitless, unrestricted balance of his father's stolen credit cards. Their relationship had never been a partnership. It was a ruthless, entirely transactional arrangement. Without the fake corporate titan illusion, without the custom marble island and the private beach club memberships, he was absolutely nothing to her. He was staring directly down the barrel of an imminent felony warrant for aggravated identity theft and massive wire fraud. He was completely terrified of the federal prison sentence waiting for him the moment he stepped out of the building. Yet Victoria did not express a single ounce of concern for his severe legal jeopardy or his physical safety. She was exclusively obsessively furious about her rapidly plummeting online follower count and her impending downgrade in urban zip codes. Sean turned away mechanically, folding another expensive silk tie, feeling the absolute crushing isolation of a man who had intentionally destroyed his own family to secure a woman who viewed him purely as a defective ATM. Victoria, however, utterly refused to leave the penthouse empty-handed. If Vanguard Properties intended to throw her out onto the street, she was aggressively determined to extract every single ounce of financial value from the unit before the legal clock expired. She set her furious sights on the massive custom-built crystal chandelier suspended directly above the formal dining area. The heavy fixture was an architectural masterpiece intricately wired into the ceiling and incredibly expensive. It was a piece that entirely defined the luxury aesthetic of the dining space. It belonged unequivocally to the property legally bound to the unit's permanent fixtures. Victoria did not care about the legalities or the building codes. She dragged a heavy aluminum stepladder to the center of the room, climbed up in her designer sneakers, and began aggressively unhooking the heavy crystal tiers. Sean watched her reckless, desperate vandalism with hollow, defeated eyes. He entirely lacked the energy or the willpower to stop her. He knew Vanguard Properties would simply add the exorbitant cost of the stolen chandelier to the massive, inescapable civil judgment already piling up against them. Victoria was operating on pure, spiteful vengeance and desperate greed. She carefully wrapped the heavy crystal structure in thick, moving blankets, violently shoving the jagged metal base into a reinforced cardboard box. She aggressively taped the box shut with a triumphant, malicious sneer, fully convinced she had successfully outsmarted the ruthless corporate conglomerate. Victoria grabbed the heavy cardboard box, groaning under the immense weight as she dragged it across the scratched hardwood floors toward the heavy mahogany front door. She threw the door open, stepping confidently out into the hushed, deeply carpeted hallway. She fully intended to load the stolen lighting fixture into the service elevator and simply disappear into the city. She did not make it past the threshold of her doorway. Two towering, highly trained private security contractors dressed in dark, unbranded tactical uniforms immediately stepped directly into her path. They did not shout. They did not raise their hands or draw their weapons. They simply shifted their weight, forming a broad, impenetrable human wall between Victoria and the polished elevator bank. Their posture was relaxed but entirely unyielding. Victoria puffed out her chest, instantly reverting to her entitled, aristocratic socialite persona. She loudly demanded that they step aside, haughtily claiming she was merely moving her personal, privately owned belongings down to the commercial loading dock. She sharply threatened to call their corporate supervisor and have them instantly terminated for harassing a legitimate luxury resident. The lead security contractor did not blink. His expression remained entirely carved from stone. He slowly reached into his heavy tactical vest, pulled out a thick laminated clipboard, and held it up directly for Victoria to read. It was the comprehensive, legally binding fixture inventory list provided directly by Vanguard Properties' legal division. The contractor tapped a thick, black-gloved finger against the third highly detailed item on the typed manifest. It clearly and explicitly listed the custom crystal dining chandelier as permanent, non-transferable corporate property. The contractor looked down at the heavy, suspiciously shaped cardboard box resting heavily against Victoria's designer sneakers. He spoke with a low, gravelly voice completely devoid of any emotion or leniency. He flatly informed her that removing structural assets from the commercial premises constituted active, undeniable theft. He explicitly stated that if she attempted to move the box 1 single inch closer to the service elevator, he was legally authorized to physically detain her in the hallway until the municipal police arrived to formally process the burglary charges. The loud, aggressive commotion in the quiet hallway did not go unnoticed. The heavy mahogany doors of the neighboring luxury units slowly began to swing open. The incredibly wealthy elite residents of the 34th floor stepped out onto the plush carpet to actively observe the spectacle unfolding in front of them. These were the very same affluent socialites Victoria had relentlessly tried to impress. They were the prominent neighbors she had bragged to and aggressively postured against for 3 consecutive years. They stood comfortably in their doorways, wearing tailored loungewear and holding expensive morning coffees, silently watching the highly publicized, spectacular downfall of the penthouse influencer. They did not offer assistance. They did not intervene on her behalf. They simply watched with cold, fascinated amusement as Victoria was publicly cornered and humiliated by armed corporate guards for attempting to steal a light fixture. The ultimate crushing humiliation crashed down on Victoria. The color rushed entirely out of her face, leaving her pale, wide-eyed, and visibly trembling. She was trapped under the harsh judging stares of the exact elite demographic she worshipped and desperately wanted to belong to. She could not talk her way out of the undeniable situation. She could not manipulate or charm the stoic security contractors blocking her path. The absolute reality of her complete social and financial destruction settled over her. She slowly loosened her white-knuckled grip on the heavy cardboard box. She let it drop onto the hallway carpet with a dull, defeated, pathetic thud. Without uttering a single word, without making eye contact with any of her wealthy neighbors, she turned around and rapidly retreated back into the gutted, devastated ruins of the penthouse. She slammed the heavy front door shut, securely locking herself inside the debris of her completely shattered illusion. The two security contractors remained perfectly still in the hallway, their eyes fixed firmly on the closed mahogany door, ensuring the isolation of the fraudulent tenants was absolute and unbreakable. The final morning broke with a dull, heavy gray light filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the 34th floor. Down on the street level, a massive commercial moving truck idled aggressively at the curb, its heavy diesel engine vibrating against the wet concrete. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of life or warmth. The towering walls were stripped bare, exposing faded paint, and the custom hardwood floors were severely scratched from the frantic, careless dragging of heavy furniture. Victoria had retreated into a state of absolute stony silence. She moved through the devastated rooms like a ghost, completely refusing to look at Sean, communicating her absolute disdain only through sharp, venomous glares. She mechanically packed her remaining designer shoes into a heavy plastic tote, zipped her oversized cashmere coat, and walked directly out the front door without uttering a single final goodbye. She stepped into the long, carpeted hallway past the silent, heavily armed corporate security guards without making eye contact and disappeared into the waiting elevator. Sean was left standing completely alone in the center of the ruined living room. The crushing reality of his total failure finally descended upon him, instantly mutating into a toxic, blinding rage. He had aggressively lost his pristine corporate persona, his wealthy, socially connected wife, his elite social standing, and his entire fabricated wealthy future. He had absolutely nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. He completely refused to walk out of the luxury building quietly. He desperately needed a target for his overwhelming, suffocating humiliation. He needed to inflict a wound so deep and permanent that it would make his father feel the exact same agonizing despair currently burning in his own chest. Victoria's unhinged, hysterical threat from the previous afternoon echoed loudly and clearly in his mind. He turned his gaze slowly toward the center of the devastated kitchen. The massive imported marble kitchen island stood perfectly intact amidst the chaotic, sprawling debris of the move-out. It was a flawless, polished slab of brilliant white stone laced with deep, intricate veins of silver and gold. Decades ago, long before Sean had adopted his arrogant, untouchable corporate facade, Malcolm had brought him to this exact spot. Malcolm had run his calloused working-class hands over the smooth surface of the stone and told Sean its specific history. The marble had been imported directly from a high-end, exclusive quarry in Italy. It was not a casual, aesthetic purchase. It was a highly specific, incredibly expensive gift from Elaine, purchased entirely with the quiet savings she had meticulously accumulated over 10 consecutive years. She had ordered the massive stone just months before she passed away, intending it to be her permanent, beautiful mark on the family's real estate portfolio. Malcolm had treated that kitchen island as a sacred shrine to his late wife. It was the absolute, undeniable centerpiece of his proudest property, an architectural manifestation of Elaine's enduring, loving presence. Sean stared at the pristine Italian marble, his vision narrowing into a dark, spiteful tunnel. Destroying the drywall or scratching the floors was simple, petty vandalism. Shattering Elaine's dying gift was a direct, calculated, emotional assassination. He wanted to entirely obliterate his mother's memory purely to maximize his father's psychological suffering. He wanted Malcolm to walk confidently into the empty penthouse and find his most treasured, sacred possession reduced to worthless, jagged rubble. Sean marched aggressively toward the utility closet near the rear service entrance. The commercial movers had left behind a heavy industrial steel sledgehammer leaning carelessly against the drywall. Sean grabbed the thick fiberglass handle. The tool was incredibly heavy, designed specifically for demolishing load-bearing concrete and thick brick walls. He dragged the sledgehammer out of the utility closet, the heavy steel head scraping loudly against the vinyl floor planks. His breathing became ragged and shallow, entirely fueled by adrenaline and malicious, vindictive intent. He walked back into the center of the kitchen, gripping the thick handle with both sweating hands. He stood directly in front of the marble island, planting his designer boots firmly on the scratched floor. He did not hesitate. He did not stop to consider the logistical consequences or the severe legal ramifications of his actions. He was operating purely on the destructive, uncontrollable momentum of a cornered, humiliated man. He hoisted the heavy steel sledgehammer high above his shoulder, pulling his arms back with all his remaining physical strength. He let out a harsh, guttural shout of pure toxic rage and swung the heavy tool down directly onto the absolute center of the Italian marble. The impact was utterly deafening. The sharp, explosive crack of shattering stone violently ruptured the heavy silence of the empty penthouse. The immense concentrated force of the steel sledgehammer completely compromised the structural integrity of the massive slab. A huge, jagged fissure instantly shot through the silver and gold veins, tearing the beautiful surface entirely apart. Sean did not stop. He pulled the heavy hammer back and struck the stone a second time, putting his entire body weight behind the violent swing. The marble buckled and collapsed inward. Large, heavy shards of razor-sharp stone exploded outward, raining down onto the floor in a catastrophic, dangerous spray of debris. The pristine centerpiece of the kitchen was instantly reduced to a ruined, worthless crater. Sean stood over the destroyed island, panting heavily, a sick, twisted sense of victory briefly washing over him. He wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead, completely convinced he had just successfully executed the ultimate devastating revenge against his father. He genuinely believed he had just destroyed Malcolm's most prized possession. He was entirely, fatally wrong. Sean completely failed to understand the bureaucratic legal reality of the documents Malcolm had forcefully presented at the mediation table. Malcolm no longer held the deed to the penthouse. Malcolm had absolutely no financial or emotional stake in the imported Italian marble. Sean had not vandalized his father's personal property. He had just aggressively and intentionally executed a massive felony destruction of corporate property against a ruthless multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerate. He had just taken a steel sledgehammer to a highly valuable asset exclusively owned by Vanguard Properties. The deafening explosive crashes of the sledgehammer hitting the solid stone echoed instantly through the heavy mahogany front door and directly into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The private armed security contractors stationed diligently outside did not pause to investigate the noise. They did not politely knock on the door or loudly announce their presence. They operated on strict, uncompromising corporate protocols regarding immediate asset protection. Any active physical destruction of the interior triggered an immediate, forceful tactical response. Before Sean could even lower the heavy sledgehammer to the floor, the front door of the penthouse violently burst open. The heavy wood slammed brutally against the interior drywall, completely shattering the brass hinges. The two towering security contractors breached the entryway with terrifying clinical speed. They moved with absolute synchronized precision, their heavy tactical boots thudding loudly against the flooring as they aggressively rushed into the kitchen. Sean froze, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror as the massive men rapidly closed the distance between them. He instantly dropped the heavy steel sledgehammer, stepping backward and raising his empty hands in a frantic, pathetic gesture of total surrender. He tried to stammer out a desperate defense, attempting to loudly claim he was merely dismantling his own personal furniture. The security team completely ignored his pathetic, stammering excuses. The lead contractor lunged forward without hesitation, grabbing Sean by the shoulder of his designer shirt and sweeping his legs out from under him with a brutal, practiced tactical maneuver. Sean hit the ruined floor hard, the breath violently expelled from his lungs as his chest crashed directly onto the scattered shards of broken Italian marble. The contractor immediately drove his heavy knee directly into the center of Sean's spine, firmly pinning him against the jagged stone. Sean let out a sharp, breathless cry of absolute pain, totally unable to move or resist the overwhelming physical force. The second contractor moved in instantly, aggressively, pulling Sean's wrists forcefully behind his back. The sharp, distinctive zip of heavy-duty plastic restraints echoed in the devastated kitchen as his hands were violently secured together. The lead contractor maintained his heavy, crushing weight on Sean's back. He did not raise his voice. He did not read Sean his rights or offer any form of polite explanation. He spoke with a cold, entirely mechanical tone, pressing his face close to Sean's ear. He flatly informed the terrified marketing director that the municipal police were already in transit to formally arrest him for aggravated felony vandalism and corporate sabotage. Sean lay completely immobilized on the cold, ruined floor, his cheek pressed directly against the sharp, shattered remains of his mother's beautiful marble island. The sick, twisted victory he had felt just moments prior instantly evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold, crushing certainty of his immediate destruction. He had aggressively tried to burn his father's world to the ground out of pure spite. Instead, he had successfully and permanently locked himself inside a federal prison cell. The absolute unyielding grip of the plastic restraints cut sharply into his wrists, signaling the definitive irreversible end of his arrogant corporate illusion. I sat in the worn driver's seat of my Ford pickup truck, parked in a designated commercial loading zone directly across the street from the towering glass and steel facade of the Vanguard Properties building. The heavy diesel engine hummed a steady, vibrating rhythm beneath my work boots. The gray afternoon had given way to a sharp, biting wind carrying a light mist that forced me to run the windshield wipers on an intermittent cycle. Through the sweeping arcs of the rubber blades, I maintained a clear, unobstructed view of the pristine, illuminated main lobby. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the calluses scraping against the leather cover. A profound, heavy ache settled deep within the center of my chest, a physical manifestation of a grief I had been holding at bay for weeks. I had never wanted this. No father ever dreams of watching his own flesh and blood being escorted out of a building in steel handcuffs. It went against every natural paternal instinct I possessed. My entire life had been dedicated to providing a safe, secure foundation for my family. However, the stark reality of the situation offered no room for sentimentality. I stared at the luxury high-rise and forced myself to acknowledge the brutal truth. I had spent decades quietly absorbing the financial blows, cleaning up the messes, and silently writing the checks to shield Sean from the harsh realities of the world. I had believed I was protecting him. The agonizing clarity of the present moment revealed the absolute failure of that strategy. Shielding a grown man from the legal and moral consequences of his own actions does not foster growth. It only breeds a calculating, entitled monster. Sean had interpreted my silent sacrifices as a weakness to be endlessly exploited. He had mistaken my fatherly patience for a blank check to fund his fraudulent existence. Letting him fall today was the only remaining option. It was a required, necessary amputation to stop the infection of his deceit from spreading any further. The low hum of the city traffic was suddenly pierced by the sharp rising wail of emergency sirens. The piercing sound echoed loudly off the concrete canyons of the downtown financial district, rapidly drawing closer. Within seconds, 2 municipal police cruisers aggressively rounded the corner, their tires screeching harshly against the wet asphalt. They did not pull politely into the valet circle. The lead cruiser hopped the curb, angling its heavy reinforced bumper directly toward the primary glass entrance of the luxury building. The secondary vehicle boxed in the loading zone, a calculated tactical maneuver designed to secure the immediate perimeter. The flashing red and blue emergency lights washed violently over the pristine marble columns of the lobby, completely shattering the quiet, exclusive atmosphere of the residential tower. 4 uniformed officers instantly exited the vehicles. They moved with a rigid, highly trained urgency, their hands resting instinctively on their heavy duty belts. They bypassed the panicked concierge desk entirely, their heavy black boots thudding loudly against the imported tile as they rushed directly toward the private resident elevators. I watched the digital floor indicator above the elevator bank begin its rapid ascent toward the 34th floor. The corporate security team I had mobilized through Vanguard Properties had clearly executed their protocol flawlessly. The municipal police were not arriving to negotiate a civil dispute. They were responding to an active, verified felony in progress. The trap I had carefully constructed had fully sprung, permanently locking its steel jaws around my son. The wait felt like an eternity, though the digital clock on my dashboard indicated that barely 10 minutes had passed. The elevator indicator lights finally reversed direction, descending rapidly back to the ground floor. The polished stainless steel doors slid open, and the grim reality of Sean's choices spilled out into the brightly lit lobby. Sean emerged first, physically flanked by 2 massive municipal police officers. His arms were forcefully twisted and secured tightly behind his back, bound by heavy steel handcuffs that caught the harsh glare of the lobby chandeliers. The physical transformation was staggering. The untouchable, arrogant corporate marketing director who had confidently threatened me across a mediation table was entirely gone. His expensive tailored Italian dress shirt was violently torn at the shoulder seam, exposing his bare skin. The dark fabric was heavily smeared and caked in thick white marble dust, a direct, undeniable consequence of his destructive rampage against the kitchen island. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess plastered to his sweating forehead. His face was completely drained of color, pale and slack with the overwhelming crushing shock of his immediate incarceration. The officers marched him aggressively through the expansive lobby, giving him absolutely no opportunity to slow his pace or hide his face. As the automatic glass doors slid open and the cold wind hit him, Sean instinctively raised his head. His frantic, terrified eyes scanned the busy street, desperately searching for a way out. His gaze locked directly onto the windshield of my parked Ford. For a long, silent moment, we stared at each other across the divide of the busy avenue. I did not avert my eyes. I did not offer a comforting nod. I looked at him with the cold, unyielding finality of a judge who had just delivered a necessary sentence. Sean's shoulders sagged, his entire posture collapsing inward as the officers physically shoved him forward toward the waiting squad car. Before the officers could successfully secure Sean inside the rear of the vehicle, the lobby doors violently burst open a second time. Victoria charged out onto the wet pavement, moving with a blind, frantic momentum. She was completely unhinged. The curated, soft-spoken influencer persona she utilized to manipulate her wealthy followers had entirely evaporated, replaced by a feral, screaming manifestation of pure entitlement. She wore a designer trench coat and clutched a heavy leather handbag, shouting at the top of her lungs. Her shrill voice easily cut through the ambient noise of the heavy traffic. She aggressively demanded that the police officers instantly release her husband. She screamed that they had absolutely no legal right to enter her private property, loudly threatening to sue the entire municipal precinct into bankruptcy. She was operating under the deeply flawed assumption that her perceived social status granted her absolute immunity from criminal procedure. She forcefully marched directly into the active arrest zone, completely ignoring the stern verbal commands from the officers to step back and clear the perimeter. A female police officer stepped forward, raising her hands in a standard defensive posture to create a necessary physical boundary. She loudly instructed Victoria to retreat to the sidewalk immediately or face arrest for active interference. Victoria's toxic arrogance completely overrode any remaining shred of basic survival instinct. Instead of backing away, she let out a furious shriek and violently shoved the female officer squarely in the chest with both hands. The response was instantaneous and utterly uncompromising. The physical assault on a uniformed officer immediately escalated the situation from a verbal disturbance into an active, violent crime. The female officer absorbed the shove, instantly stepped forward, and executed a flawless tactical takedown. She grabbed Victoria by the lapels of her expensive designer coat, spun her around with brutal efficiency, and drove her face first directly into the wet, unforgiving concrete of the sidewalk. Victoria let out a sharp, breathless gasp as the impact knocked the wind entirely out of her lungs. Her heavy leather handbag went skidding across the dirty asphalt, spilling expensive cosmetics directly into the gutter. Two additional officers instantly rushed over to assist. They knelt on Victoria's back, aggressively pulling her flailing arms behind her and securing her wrists with a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Victoria writhed against the cold pavement, sobbing and screaming wildly, but she was completely immobilized. She was quickly hauled back to her feet. Her immaculate hair ruined her designer coat, stained with dirty street water. The loud, violent commotion had drawn a significant audience. The affluent residents of the luxury building, along with dozens of passing pedestrians, had stopped entirely. Every single person on the street had pulled out their cell phone. The harsh glare of camera flashes and the red recording lights illuminated the chaotic scene. The wealthy neighbors Victoria had desperately tried to impress were now documenting her absolute humiliating destruction in high definition. There was no sympathy in the crowd, only cold, fascinated observation. I sat in my truck and watched as the officers forcefully pushed Victoria into the back of the secondary cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. Sean was already locked securely in the primary vehicle. The massive, fraudulent empire they had built on, lies stolen credit and pure manipulation, had not ended in a boardroom or a luxury vacation resort. It had ended brutally publicly in the cramped, hard plastic rear seats of two municipal police cars. I reached forward, shifted my heavy truck into gear, and merged smoothly into the flowing city traffic. I drove away from the flashing lights, leaving the shattered remnants of their fabricated lives completely behind me. I had navigated my Ford pickup barely 10 blocks away from the chaotic flashing emergency lights of the Vanguard Properties building when my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed the municipal police precinct. I pulled the heavy truck over to the curb and answered the call. Detective Miller was on the line, his voice maintaining its usual businesslike efficiency. He informed me that the arresting officers were currently transporting Sean to the station. Miller requested my immediate presence back at the precinct. The commercial bank had just rushed over a physical copy of the forged home equity line of credit application. The detective needed me to officially legally verify that the signature on the document was a fraudulent imitation of my own before he stepped into the interrogation room. I put the truck in gear, executed a sharp U-turn, and headed back toward the brutalist concrete structure of the municipal station. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the dimly lit observation corridor, staring through the thick, heavily tinted glass of a one-way mirror. The sterile interrogation room on the other side of the glass was stark and entirely devoid of comfort. Sean sat in a rigid steel chair bolted directly to the scuffed linoleum floor. The aggressive physical reality of his arrest had left undeniable marks. His tailored imported dress shirt was violently torn at the shoulder seam and heavily coated in the fine white dust of the shattered Italian marble. Despite his disheveled, ruined appearance, his posture remained aggressively arrogant. He slouched back in the cold metal chair, bouncing his knee, rapidly exuding the impatient annoyance of a busy corporate executive who had been momentarily delayed by a trivial administrative error. Through the audio speaker mounted on the observation wall, I could hear Sean muttering under his breath. He was running a continuous, highly delusional mental calculation. He loudly complained to the empty room about the sheer incompetence of the private security guards threatening to sue them for physical assault. He was completely convinced that the municipal police had made a massive jurisdictional error. In his fractured, self-absorbed reality, the destruction of the Marble Island was merely a misunderstanding between a tenant and a landlord. He was waiting for me to walk through the heavy metal door with an open checkbook and a high-priced defense attorney. For his entire life, Sean had relied exclusively on that specific, deeply ingrained dynamic. Whenever he found himself standing at the edge of a self-created disaster, he simply waited for me to absorb the impact. When he totaled his mother's car in high school, I had worked overtime to cover the repairs and keep his insurance rates from skyrocketing. When he failed out of his first prestigious university due to excessive partying, I had quietly paid the exorbitant tuition fees to transfer him to another academic program, shielding him from the absolute shame of expulsion. He had spent 3 decades treating my fatherly leniency as an unconditional ironclad guarantee. As I watched him brush the marble dust from his torn sleeve with a contemptuous sneer, I knew he genuinely believed I would drop the vandalism charges the moment he offered a halfway convincing apology. He was utterly certain that a father's anger was temporary while my financial protection was permanent. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room clicked open. Detective Miller stepped inside carrying a massive, incredibly thick manila file. He did not offer Sean a polite greeting. He did not ask if he needed a glass of water or a moment to compose himself. Miller walked directly to the scarred metal table, pulled out the opposite chair, and sat down. He dropped the heavy file onto the table with a loud, authoritative thud that caused Sean to flinch slightly. Sean immediately leaned forward, launching into a rapid, aggressive defense. He demanded his cell phone, claiming he needed to contact his father to clear up a ridiculous, overblown property dispute. He stated that Vanguard Properties had no legal right to detain him, and that his father would easily cover the cost of the damaged kitchen island. He spoke with the condescending authority of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room, totally oblivious to the absolute destruction waiting for him inside the manila folder. Detective Miller let Sean finish his arrogant, breathless monologue. The seasoned investigator did not argue or attempt to correct the narrative. He simply opened the file and began extracting the documents. He spoke with a low clinical tone, perfectly articulating the sheer magnitude of the impending legal avalanche. Miller flatly informed Sean that the municipal charge for felony destruction of corporate property was the absolute least of his current problems. Vanguard Properties possessed high-definition security footage and a signed confession from the responding tactical contractors. The vandalism charge was an open and shut case that would carry mandatory restitution and potential state jail time, but it was merely the opening act of his legal nightmare. Miller slid the first set of printed statements across the metal table. He told Sean that an active authorized felony warrant had officially cleared the system 20 minutes prior. He pointed a steady finger at the highlighted vendor codes, the delivery manifests, and the IP login timestamps tracing directly back to the penthouse router. He explicitly read the charges aloud. Sean was being formally booked for aggravated identity theft and massive wire fraud. He detailed the $40,000 stolen through the fraudulently opened credit lines listing the designer handbags, the vintage watch, and the private Coastal Beach Club membership. I watched through the glass as the arrogant sneer completely vanished from Sean's face. The blood drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening ashen gray. His eyes darted frantically across the credit card statements, instantly recognizing the undeniable physical proof of his theft. The confident corporate titan facade began to violently fracture, exposing the terrified, cornered criminal hiding underneath. He stammered, attempting to formulate a lie about shared accounts and authorized familial spending, but his voice cracked entirely devoid of conviction. Detective Miller did not pause to allow Sean to recover his composure. He reached back into the thick file and pulled out the forged commercial bank application for the home equity line of credit. He placed it directly in front of Sean, tapping the fraudulent signature line with the tip of his pen. Miller explained the exact unforgiving nature of the banking system. Because Sean had actively attempted to leverage corporate equity from a federally insured institution using forged credentials and interstate digital wire transfers, the crime had instantly crossed municipal and state lines. It was no longer a local police matter. The fraudulent application had triggered an automatic mandatory federal investigation. The FBI had already been officially notified and would be arriving at the precinct by the end of the business day to assume total jurisdiction over the fraud charges. Sean physically recoiled from the table, pressing his back hard against the rigid steel chair. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. Pure, unadulterated panic completely consumed him. He desperately looked at Detective Miller and practically begged the investigator to call his father. He screamed that his dad would drop the charges, that his dad would pay back the credit card companies, that his dad would fix the bank application. He shouted that Malcolm would never allow his only son to go to a federal penitentiary. Detective Miller leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and delivered the final fatal strike to Sean's lifelong illusion. He looked directly into Sean's panicked eyes and spoke with absolute crushing clarity. Miller informed him that Malcolm was not coming to save him. He stated that Malcolm was the exact person who had compiled the digital evidence, pulled the credit reports, and walked directly into the precinct to sign the sworn criminal affidavit. He explained that Malcolm had just officially verified the forged signature on the federal bank application. His father was not the victim waiting to be placated. His father was the prosecution's primary, undisputed star witness. The psychological collapse was instantaneous and total. Sean stared at the forged bank document, the reality of his profound, absolute isolation finally breaking through his impenetrable ego. The lifelong safety net he had aggressively exploited and carelessly taken for granted had been completely intentionally severed by the very man who had woven it. He realized with terrifying certainty that there was no checkbook coming to cover this debt. There was no high-priced legal team rushing to negotiate a settlement. He had aggressively manipulated and stolen from the only person on earth who had ever truly protected him. Sean dropped his face into his trembling hands, the heavy metal handcuffs clinking sharply against the table. The brilliant marketing director, the wealthy penthouse owner, and the untouchable son ceased to exist. He was nothing more than a broken man sitting in a sterile room staring into the dark, inescapable abyss of a federal prison sentence. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung shut with a definitive echoing thud, sealing us inside the sterile, highly regulated environment. It had been exactly 4 months since the violent, chaotic arrest in the pristine marble lobby of the Vanguard Properties high-rise. I sat entirely motionless in the very last row of the cold wood-paneled gallery, my calloused hands resting quietly on my knees. The air inside the massive room was stale and highly conditioned, smelling faintly of floor wax and old dusty paper. The heavy side door located near the judge's elevated bench finally opened, and the armed federal bailiff escorted the defendants directly into the room. Sean and Victoria shuffled forward, their ankles securely bound by heavy metal chains that clinked sharply and rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The visual transformation was absolute brutal and entirely unforgiving. The $1,000 custom-tailored Italian suits and the bespoke designer dresses were entirely gone, permanently replaced by shapeless, standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuits. They looked incredibly small, stripped entirely of the aggressive, wealthy aesthetic they had weaponized to intimidate the world around them. I stared intently at the back of my son's head as he took his seat at the heavy wooden defense table. The harsh, unflattering fluorescent lighting highlighted the thinning, unstyled patches of his hair and the pale, unhealthy tone of his skin. Looking at his defeated, slumping posture, a very specific, sharp memory suddenly surfaced in my mind. I remembered a humid summer afternoon in my old garage. Sean had been exactly 7 years old, wearing faded denim overalls covered in dark grease stains. I had handed him a pair of heavy, red-handled wire strippers, patiently showing him how to carefully peel back the thick rubber casing to expose the bright, conductive copper wire underneath. I had guided his small, eager hands, teaching him how to properly connect a basic electrical circuit to a small battery. When the tiny bulb finally flickered to life, his face had absolutely illuminated with genuine earned pride. He had understood the direct, undeniable correlation between hard, physical work and a tangible, positive result. Sitting in the cold courtroom, a heavy, suffocating sadness settled deep in my chest. I silently wondered exactly when that eager, hard-working boy had mutated into the fraudulent man sitting before the federal judge. I wondered what specific day he had actively decided that honest, calloused labor was entirely beneath him. He had intentionally traded the quiet dignity of building something real for the toxic, fragile illusion of a stolen corporate empire. The federal judge, a stern, gray-haired woman with a well-known reputation for absolute intolerance toward financial predators, called the sentencing hearing to order. Sean's court-appointed public defender stood up nervously, adjusting his cheap glasses. The lawyer launched into a highly rehearsed, entirely pathetic narrative specifically designed to manufacture sympathy. He attempted to paint Sean as a tragic, helpless victim of a toxic, hyper-competitive corporate culture. The defender aggressively argued that the immense, crushing pressure to maintain a specific luxury aesthetic in the downtown executive sphere had driven his client to make desperate, uncharacteristic errors in judgment. He claimed Sean was suffering from severe financial anxiety and had merely borrowed funds with the full, albeit misguided, intention of paying everything back once his career stabilized. Victoria's separate defense attorney immediately followed, aggressively attempting to sever her entirely from her husband's sinking ship. Her lawyer painted Victoria as a naive, financially illiterate housewife who had been completely manipulated and kept in the dark by her controlling husband. She claimed Victoria was an innocent bystander, utterly unaware of the forged documents, the stolen credit lines, and the massive wire fraud funding her extravagant lifestyle. The federal prosecutor rose smoothly from her table. She did not raise her voice. She did not resort to dramatic, theatrical, emotional appeals. She operated with the cold, surgical precision of a butcher breaking down a carcass. She approached the judge's bench and systematically, ruthlessly dismantled the entire defense narrative piece by piece. She began by directly addressing Victoria's absurd claim of innocent ignorance. The prosecutor tapped a single button on her laptop, instantly broadcasting a crisp, high-definition audio recording throughout the silent courtroom. Victoria's shrill, unhinged voice echoed loudly off the wood-paneled walls. It was the exact recording I had captured on my cell phone in my kitchen, the very same digital file I had forwarded to the Vanguard Properties acquisition director. The entire gallery listened in dead silence as Victoria aggressively detailed her violent, malicious plans to take a heavy steel hammer to the imported Marble Island, shatter the panoramic skyline windows, and completely strip the valuable copper wiring from the penthouse walls. The audio definitively proved she was not a passive, manipulated victim. She was an active, vindictive participant, wholly willing to destroy millions of dollars in corporate property out of pure entitled spite. Victoria shrank down in her hard wooden chair, her face burning a deep, humiliated crimson as her false narrative collapsed publicly. The prosecutor immediately pivoted her devastating focus back to Sean. She held up a thick, heavily bound stack of physical evidence, dropping it loudly onto the wooden podium. She presented the forged commercial bank application for the home equity line of credit. She explicitly detailed how Sean had intentionally, maliciously stolen my identity, utilizing my impeccable credit history and my physical property address to secure an unauthorized, massive federal loan. She read the timestamps, the IP address logs, and the delivery manifests connecting the fraudulent $40,000 credit card debt directly to the luxury penthouse. The prosecutor mercilessly listed the items purchased with my stolen identity: the designer handbags, the imported luxury watches, the exclusive Coastal Beach Club memberships. She highlighted the absolute undeniable premeditation required to execute such a complex, multi-layered financial grift. This was not a panicked, split-second error in judgment caused by corporate anxiety. It was a calculated, sustained, and highly predatory attack against his own father. Sean kept his eyes firmly glued to the scarred wooden table, totally unable to look at the prosecutor, the judge, or the gallery behind him. He was entirely trapped in an ironclad web of his own arrogant design. The federal judge leaned forward, clasping her hands tightly together atop the high bench. Her expression was a mask of absolute, unfiltered disgust. She looked directly down at Sean and Victoria, explicitly ignoring their pale, defeated defense attorneys. She spoke with a voice that cut through the silent room like a serrated blade. She stated that in her 20 years on the federal bench, she had rarely encountered two individuals so entirely devoid of basic moral character, empathy, or genuine remorse. She directly addressed their suffocating entitlement, highlighting exactly how they had aggressively cannibalized their own family simply to finance a fraudulent, shallow public image. She flatly rejected the offensive notion that societal pressure or corporate culture excused predatory financial theft. She made it explicitly clear to the entire courtroom that they were not unfortunate victims of circumstance. They were the active, malicious architects of their own total destruction. The public humiliation was absolute, total, and unavoidable. Their fake empire had not just crumbled, it had been systematically exposed and prosecuted under the harsh, unyielding light of the federal justice system. The federal judge adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, her severe gaze dropping back down to the defense table. The heavy, suffocating silence in the courtroom stretched on thick with the undeniable reality of absolute ruin. She organized the thick stacks of manila folders before her, deliberately separating the individual charges. When she finally spoke again, she directed her complete, unyielding attention entirely onto Victoria. The judge recounted the specific details of the assault outside the Vanguard Properties high-rise. She described the violent, unprovoked shove against a uniformed female police officer as the ultimate pathetic manifestation of unchecked arrogance. She explicitly noted that Victoria had operated under the deeply toxic delusion that her perceived wealth and curated online status elevated her entirely above the fundamental laws of society. The judge made it exceptionally clear that the federal and municipal courts harbored absolutely zero tolerance for affluent individuals who treated law enforcement and working-class professionals like disposable servants. The sentence was delivered with a cold, mechanical finality. Victoria was officially ordered to serve 5 years of heavy, strictly monitored probation. She was entirely forbidden from leaving the state boundaries or associating with any known felons, a strict legal restriction that would immediately and permanently sever her from her husband. Furthermore, the judge mandated her complete, unwavering attendance in an intensive state-sponsored anger management program. Finally, she handed down the most devastating blow to Victoria's aristocratic ego. She ordered 500 hours of mandatory physical community service. The judge specifically mandated that these hours be served on municipal beautification crews, requiring Victoria to wear a heavy, high-visibility canvas vest and physically collect garbage along the very same downtown streets she had previously strutted down in $1,000 designer heels. As the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, Victoria physically collapsed inward. She buried her face in her shackled hands, her shoulders heaving as loud theatrical sobs echoed through the quiet gallery. From my vantage point in the back row, I watched her complete breakdown with absolute clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I knew exactly what was fueling her dramatic display of despair. She was not crying out of genuine remorse for her violent actions. She was not shedding tears over the destruction of her marriage or the severe legal jeopardy she had actively encouraged. Victoria was weeping exclusively for herself. I remembered the very first time Sean had brought her to my modest home. I remembered the cold, calculating way her eyes had immediately scanned my faded furniture, instantly assessing my net worth and finding it utterly lacking. She was crying because her carefully fabricated, highly lucrative social media brand was permanently dead. She was mourning the absolute loss of her luxury condo, her exclusive beach club memberships, and her elite, untouchable facade. The heavy realization that she was entirely stripped of her wealth and forced into grueling manual labor had completely shattered her fragile narcissistic reality. The judge allowed Victoria's sobbing to echo for a brief, uncomfortable moment before sharply ordering her defense attorney to control his client. She then shifted her fierce, unforgiving gaze directly onto Sean. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet entirely. The judge meticulously outlined the sheer staggering magnitude of his deceit. She referenced the $40,000 in identity theft, the highly predatory wire fraud, and the incredibly reckless forgery of federal banking documents. She then addressed the sledgehammer. She spoke of the violent, senseless destruction of the imported Italian marble island, explicitly noting the malicious intent required to shatter a multi-million-dollar corporation's property purely out of vindictive spite against his own family. Sean's public defender attempted to stand weakly, opening his mouth to offer one final pathetic plea for judicial mercy. The defender had previously argued that Sean was merely a victim of immense corporate pressure, but that illusion was entirely dead. The judge instantly raised a single hand, silencing the lawyer with a look of absolute authority. She stated that white-collar criminals routinely expected the justice system to treat their financial predation with a gentle reprimand and a nominal fine. She loudly declared that white-collar entitlement would receive absolutely no leniency in her courtroom today. She looked directly at Sean, her voice ringing out with undeniable, crushing authority. She formally sentenced him to 3 consecutive years in a state correctional facility. She explicitly denied any possibility of early parole, probation, or alternative house arrest, citing the violent nature of the property destruction and the deeply predatory, calculated mechanics of the identity theft against his own father. The sharp, echoing crack of the gavel hitting the wooden block signaled the definitive, irreversible end of Sean's life as he knew it. The federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the side doors. They moved with heavy practiced efficiency, grabbing Sean by his slumped shoulders and hauling him roughly to his feet. The heavy metal chains binding his ankles clinked harshly against the polished floorboards. At that exact moment, a profound primal panic visibly seized my son. The arrogant corporate executive was completely gone, entirely replaced by a terrified, desperate child. He violently twisted his body against the firm grip of the armed bailiffs. He frantically turned his head, his wide, bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the crowded wooden benches of the gallery. He was searching for a lifeline. He was searching for the safety net that had always miraculously materialized to catch him before he hit the ground. His frantic gaze finally found me sitting quietly in the very last row. We locked eyes across the vast, silent expanse of the federal courtroom. The distance between us felt like a massive, unbridgeable canyon. I saw the absolute terror radiating from his face. I saw his lips part slightly, offering a silent, desperate plea for help. He was begging for a last-minute intervention. He was hoping against all rational logic that I would suddenly stand up, halt the legal proceedings, produce my checkbook, and somehow purchase his freedom. He was relying on the ancient, deeply ingrained dynamic where Malcolm always stepped in to absorb the damage, clean up the wreckage, and pay away the severe consequences of Sean's reckless actions. I felt the heavy, familiar ache in my chest, the ancient paternal instinct urging me to protect my boy from harm. I remembered teaching a 7-year-old Sean how to wire a basic circuit in my garage, watching his face light up with the pride of honest work. But I immediately crushed that nostalgic feeling down into dust. I remembered the cold, callous way he had looked at me across the mediation table. I remembered the forged signature on the bank documents, the stolen credit cards, and the absolute destruction of Elaine's memory in the kitchen of the penthouse. Shielding him now would only validate his monstrous behavior and completely negate the brutal consequences he had rightfully earned. I held his desperate gaze. I did not frown. I did not glare. My expression remained entirely neutral, carved from unyielding stone. I let the absolute finality of my silence wash over him, ensuring he fully comprehended that the bridge between us was permanently burned to ash. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my hands on the wooden pew in front of me and pushed myself up to my feet. I did not offer him a final nod of reassurance. I turned my back on my son, facing the heavy double oak doors leading out of the gallery. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped directly out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the city street. The heavy doors swung shut behind me with a loud, satisfying thud, locking the past away forever. The painful, necessary lesson was finally complete. The heavy, polished oak doors of the federal courthouse had closed behind me with a deeply satisfying, resonant thud, entirely severing me from the frantic, desperate energy of my son. I walked down the wide granite steps and merged seamlessly into the bustling afternoon foot traffic of the city. I did not look back at the imposing architectural structure. I drove my old Ford pickup directly home, pulling into the familiar driveway with a profound sense of absolute finality. The relentless, exhausting legal war was officially over. I unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and hung my keys on the brass hook by the entryway. I walked into my kitchen, the afternoon sunlight casting long, warm shadows across the polished wooden floorboards. For the first time in over 30 years, the silence in my house was not a heavy, suffocating burden. It was not the anxious, vibrating quiet of a father waiting for the inevitable late-night phone call detailing another expensive, reckless disaster. It was the pure, unadulterated peace of a man who had successfully excised a deeply toxic, malignant tumor from his life. I filled the glass carafe with fresh water, measured out the dark coffee grounds, and turned on the machine. I leaned against the counter, listening to the steady, rhythmic dripping of the brewing coffee. I no longer had to compulsively check my phone for emergency overdraft alerts. I no longer had to calculate how many overtime hours I needed to work to secretly cover the extravagant, fraudulent lifestyle of an arrogant corporate executive. I poured myself a hot mug of coffee and drank it in the absolute, beautiful stillness of my own unburdened existence. The following morning, the air was sharp and distinctly cold. I drove my truck out to the quiet, sprawling green hills of the municipal cemetery. I parked near the old weeping willow tree and walked the familiar winding gravel path toward Elaine's resting place. The autumn wind had scattered a thick layer of dry brown leaves across the flat granite marker. I knelt down on the damp earth and methodically brushed the debris away, my calloused fingers tracing the deeply carved letters of her name. I sat there for a long time, speaking to her with a quiet, unwavering honesty. I told her about the absolute destruction of the imported Italian marble island in the penthouse. I told her that Sean had shattered the physical manifestation of her love purely out of spite and vindictive rage. But I also told her that I finally understood the truth. Her memory was never permanently housed in a slab of imported stone. Her memory lived entirely within the quiet dignity of honest work and the unwavering integrity we had shared. I looked directly at the granite headstone and offered her my deepest, most sincere apology. I apologized for aggressively enabling Sean's toxic greed for so long. I confessed that my desperate desire to shield him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world had ultimately transformed him into a predatory monster. I had actively confused financial protection with fatherly love. I placed a fresh bouquet of yellow carnations directly over her name and made a solemn, binding promise. I swore to her that I would spend my remaining years living with deliberate, constructive purpose, entirely free from the destructive obligation of a broken son. I left the cemetery with a crystal-clear vision of my immediate future. I immediately scheduled a formal high-level meeting with Sterling and the elite legal division at Vanguard Properties. I sat in their towering glass boardroom and executed the final definitive paperwork to completely liquidate the remainder of Apex Holdings LLC. I systematically cashed out the massive accumulated equity of the commercial real estate portfolio I had meticulously built over 4 consecutive decades. The resulting financial transfer was staggering, a massive influx of pure unrestricted capital. I did not use the incredible wealth to purchase a luxury yacht, a sprawling vacation home, or any other superficial status symbol. I channeled the money directly into the raw, beating heart of the city's working class. I drove to the local municipal trade school, walking into the noisy, sawdust-filled administrative offices with a comprehensive, fully funded proposal. I utilized the liquidated capital to establish an expansive, highly robust educational scholarship program. I specifically targeted young, ambitious minority men who were desperately trying to build honest, sustainable lives within the commercial construction industry. I did not simply write a detached, anonymous check. I became intimately physically involved in the entire process. I personally purchased their heavy steel-toed boots, their first professional-grade leather tool belts, and their essential safety equipment. I completely covered their expensive vocational tuition fees. More importantly, I offered them the direct, unflinching mentorship they desperately required. I stood in the active workshops showing them how to properly measure a load-bearing wall, how to wire a complex electrical panel, and how to pour a perfectly level concrete foundation. I taught them the exact same mechanical skills I had once tried to teach a 7-year-old Sean. I watched their faces completely illuminate with genuine earned pride. They did not view physical labor as a humiliating burden. They recognized it as a powerful, honorable tool for building a secure, respectable future. Exactly 6 months after the heavy doors of the federal courtroom had closed, I stood in my quiet kitchen on a crisp Sunday afternoon. I walked out to the metal mailbox at the end of the driveway and retrieved a small stack of daily deliveries. Sandwiched between a utility bill and a local hardware store circular was a cheap, thin white envelope. The return address was explicitly stamped with the official seal of the State Correctional Penitentiary. I stared down at the blue ink. I recognized the cramped, frantic handwriting instantly. It was Sean. I did not need to tear open the sealed paper to know exactly what pathetic, manipulative narrative was contained within the folded pages. I knew Victoria had instantly filed for a ruthless, highly publicized divorce the moment she was legally barred from associating with a convicted felon. I knew Sean was currently sitting in a stark concrete cell entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his fabricated corporate authority. I knew the letter contained a desperate, sprawling plea for commissary money. I knew he was claiming to be a completely changed man, loudly declaring that he had learned his lesson and was finally ready to sit down and have that traditional Sunday dinner. He was deploying the exact same predictable emotional blackmail he had weaponized against me for his entire adult life. I stood in the driveway, the cold wind rustling the collar of my flannel shirt. I looked at the envelope. My heart rate did not elevate. My hands did not shake. I felt absolutely no residual anger, no lingering guilt, and no paternal obligation. I felt nothing but a cool, unyielding indifference. I turned around, walked calmly back inside the house, and stepped directly into my home office. I walked over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting next to the wooden desk. I did not hesitate. I did not slice the envelope open to indulge my curiosity. I fed the unopened letter directly into the grinding steel blades. The loud mechanical whirring sound instantly consumed the paper, reducing Sean's desperate, manipulative lies into thin, worthless strips of garbage. I turned off the machine, walked through the kitchen, and stepped out onto the back patio. I opened the heavy steel lid of my large backyard smoker, expertly adjusting the burning hickory wood and checking the temperature gauge. The rich, savory scent of roasting meat and wood smoke immediately filled the cool autumn air. I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple heavy truck doors slamming shut in the front driveway. A loud, booming chorus of genuine, energetic laughter echoed over the wooden fence. 5 of my newest trade school apprentices walked through the side gate carrying bags of ice-cold drinks and a genuine, profound respect for the man hosting them. They greeted me with firm, calloused handshakes and wide, honest smiles. They were eager to learn, eager to share a meal, and entirely eager to build their lives with their own 2 hands. I handed out the cold drinks, laughing at a joke one of the young electricians told about a stubborn wiring job. I looked around my backyard, surrounded by the warmth, the noise, and the undeniable authenticity of honest labor. I had finally found my true family. The toxic, parasitic illusion of my past was completely shredded, and the absolute reality of my future was burning bright and steady. I smiled, turning the meat on the smoker entirely at peace. The lesson was finally complete. True family is never defined merely by shared bloodlines or a common last name. It is forged through mutual respect, shared struggles, and unwavering honesty. When we shield people from the natural consequences of their actions, we do not protect them. We actively destroy their capacity for growth and fundamental accountability. Enabling toxic behavior out of a misplaced sense of loyalty only breeds entitlement and deep resentment. Real love requires the immense courage to enforce strict boundaries and demand personal responsibility. Ultimately, absolute dignity cannot be purchased with stolen wealth. It must be earned through pure, hard, honest physical labor. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Malcolm's final decision and hit the like button. Your support allows me to keep bringing you powerful stories like this one.